What you don't want is basically a rule of the jungle. In the jungle, basically, the mighty eats the weak, right? That's not what an economy what a good economy should be. If we basically ease, doing business and remove some of the shackles that we have on our entrepreneurs among the best in the world.
Dr. Manmohan Singh.
As an economist, I would like to think that somebody of his talent and his brilliance could have delivered more for the country.
Given India's socialist past, some of us perceive wealth creators and act of wealth creation as evil.
Take any industrialist, XYZ, okay? Their wealth, are they actually stacking it as rupee bills in their pillows and their mattresses and sleeping on them? That's a question that I want to ask. They are putting it in companies. In the late 80s, when Infosys was started, basically 6 people had started the firm. Today, they employ millions of people.
49,000 MSMEs have closed down in the last 10 years, which means 3 lakh jobs gone. Now, jobs have become a big thing.
A lot of the negative narratives have typically come using the CMI data, which I don't find it reliable. Non-agriculture jobs, 9 crore jobs have been created. That means on average 90 lakh jobs have been created over the last 10 years, on average in a year. That said, I'm not saying that employment is not something that should not be focused upon.
Freebies, please, let's go to that because we are already in election season.
Welfare spending, I actually categorize as that builds capabilities, which is to teach someone to fish. Freebies is basically just doling out loads of fish. In Karnataka, for instance, that is being given free, bus, right? Is it building any capacity? Is it actually teaching people to fish? I don't think so. That's a freebie.
Namaste, Jai Hind. You're watching or listening to another edition of the ANI podcast with Smita Prakash. My guest today is Professor Krishnamurthy V. Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor to Prime Minister Modi from 2018 to 2021. Currently, he is Executive Director, International Monetary Fund. He's often called the common man's economist. You can access more information on his views on economics in the YouTube channel Arthavarta. Professor Krishnamurthy's book, India at 100, offers a blueprint to India's planners for sustained growth to enable the country to achieve the target of becoming a $55 trillion economy by 2047, when the country celebrates 100 years since independence. Thank you so much, Professor, for coming to the podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I read this book as, I don't know if you've met friends of mine, they'll tell you how any book written by an economist, when I get it, I get really nervous. It's this childhood trauma, I see diagrams and I say, oh God, this is my board exam trauma.
It seems very odd coming from this, Smitaji, because I've been such a big fan of your podcast.
You are so kind.
No, honestly, actually, I watched many of them. And so, I hope actually I wrote it in a way that, everybody could understand it. That at least was the attempt that I made.
Yes, absolutely. So, we have common friends. Sanjeev Sanyal is a friend of mine.
Yes.
So I told him the same thing, that when I pick up the books, I get really nervous. So then some friends of mine told me that, okay, go over the contents and pick out things which you want those concepts to be demystified, and then go with that. So you don't have to go. So I did this. It was my guide to reading books, which I found difficult to comprehend, especially like on philosophy and on religion and things like that, which I find difficult to understand. So then I would go over the index and then I would look over the contents and then I would pick out things.
That's a neat way.
So then I would pick out things which I want to read and then maybe read cover to cover.
So it's like you get your first little, summary and then the details actually.
Because, if it's not your subject and you're a little worried that, and then I don't want it to keep piling up on my bedside table. Do you know what I mean?
That's a good habit actually.
So for everybody who's a student who wants to understand India, frankly, and this whole talk of, where we are going, where we are headed, and whether we are adopting the right methods, right paths to it. So please read this book. Let's start with the book. You talk, of course, everything is about, it begins with the preface also about where once in a several centuries opportunity that India has. And you talk about India, that the chances of India becoming a dominant economic force. Now, is it bold or overly ambitious to set this goal of having a $55 trillion economy by 2047. Of course, the best way to do is to read the book, but then let's first find out about where you are, because the government says it's on track to becoming a $35 trillion economy by 2047. But you are more optimistic, projecting at 55. So now, why do you say that? Why are you projecting it more than even Government of India?
Okay. So first of all, this is an independent assessment. I'm not part of the government, and this is basically my own, based on sound economic logic and data. So let me first give you a couple of examples. Let's take Japan from 1970 to 1995. The Japanese economy grew about 26 times, to be precise, 25.6 times. In 1970, the Japanese economy was about $220 billion. By 1995, it was about $5.5 trillion, growing about 26 times. Another example, China from 1996 to 2021 grew its economy in dollar terms 22 times.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm projecting here for India is actually about 15 times, slightly more than 15 times. Not as ambitious as the actual performance, to over 25-year period for Japan or China. Now, and this is premised on sound economic arguments that I've actually laid it out bottoms up. So if we take, for instance, growth to be 8% in real terms, and I'll actually expand on that, why we can achieve it. It's a good stretch goal because, if you look at historically, India has grown over the last 30 years at about 7%. So from 7% to 8% is a nice stretch goal to have. And together...
Is that a done deal, the 8%?
Well, see, when you look at it,
let's not go into black swan events.
No, I'm not going.
That.
No, I'm actually. It is not a done deal. It is not a done deal because it is ambitious. As I said, we've grown at 7%, and I think growing at 8% will require good policy.
7% is for past 2 decades.
Past close to 3 decades.
3 decades.
3 decades. We've grown at on average 7%. And if you look at even dollar rate of growth, right?
And China is at 8%.
China actually grew, during this period at the 1996 to 2021. Their rate of growth was actually close to about, maybe in percentage terms, in dollar, I think would have been about 13% or so.
So from that economic
13% in nominal dollars, not their domestic rate of growth.
Today it's at how much?
Today their economy would be about $18 trillion, and their growth rate would be about 5%. 5%, yeah.
But to reach the level what China is today, for India, we need a growth rate of?
So that's what I'm saying actually. So let me explain. Let me explain this, right? So if, for instance, India grows at 8%, that is in real terms. Real terms is basically, what we it's purchasing power, captures how much we can buy. How many kajus we can buy, how many kishmish, etc. Like that. You have to add inflation because that affects basically what will happen in nominal rupee terms. Inflation, in the last, from 2016 onwards, when India implemented the inflation targeting regime for the Reserve Bank, inflation has been 5% on average. And that is despite COVID, despite Ukraine war, etc. So that's a reasonable expectation for the future. So 8 plus 5, that's 13% in, rupee terms, the rate of growth. But when you project in, when I project, actually, you have to take into account the rate of depreciation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar, because we're projecting in dollar terms. Historically, rupee has depreciated around 3.5%. But in the book, I actually assess, having looked at several 25-year periods, I assess that if India grows at 8%, the rate of depreciation will be lower than 1%. And I can explain that, but for now, let me just provide you the calculation. So 13 minus 1 is basically 12% rate of growth in dollar terms. Now, a very useful rule to use is how much time it takes to double your money, which is, it's called the rule of 72. If you remember, national savings certificates, used to double our money in 6 years because the rate of interest was 12%, because 12 times 6 is 72. So in other words, 72 divided by 12 is 6, right? So similarly, 12% rate of growth in dollar terms means our GDP will double every 6 years. Okay. So over a 24-year period from 2023 to 2047, there'll be 4 doublings, because 24 divided by 6 is 4, right? So now, take the GDP in dollar terms in 2023. It was $3.28 trillion. I'm going to approximate it to 3.25 so that we can work with these numbers just sort of, without needing a calculator. So the first doubling from 3.25 to 6.5.
Okay.
Right? Second doubling from 6.5 to 13. third doubling from 13 to 26, fourth doubling from 26 to 52.
Regardless of government change, regardless of any of this, whichever government comes?
Well, actually, so not regardless. I think that's because, as I'm saying, this is...
policy changes could...
Of course.
Could impact on this.
Of course. But I'm taking this to be the average rate of growth, right?
Okay.
So there might be, years where we actually can grow faster. And that is conditional on us implementing good policy.
Yeah.
But there may be years where we'll actually grow a little slower.
You have this graphic in your book, which I got done here. So now this is how we need to do it.
Yes.
As per you. Now, can you go one by one on these, please?
So these are the 4 pillars that I've actually outlined as a 4-pillar strategy for India to achieve 8% growth over the next 20-25 years. The first pillar is, macroeconomic focus on growth. The reason actually I've spent 5 chapters explaining this to show that, because in a country like ours, we need to grow the pie, and that basically a focus on growth basically will deliver that. And the reason it is important is many times people talk about, what about inequality? I agree, inequality is something that we have to focus on, but that actually I cover it in the second pillar, which is inclusive growth for a large middle class. This is social and economic inclusion, of which jobs are a real critical element. And I want to expand on this because if in a democracy, if we have to have support for good economic policy, then the benefits of good economic policy has to spread far and wide.
Because you talk about empowering entrepreneurs, you talk about responsible prosperity,
Correct.
you talk about several things in this, private investments.
Yes. Yeah. So in the second, and I think that's where jobs are really critical, because the large middle class will get created when you have, economic inclusion, where you actually have, not only is the pie growing, but the benefits of that is reaching basically even to the lower middle class, who actually then grow to the, to middle class. And their jobs are really critical. So the second pillar in that, jobs, agriculture renaissance is really critical. Some of the, welfare spending that we do, I think doing it well is important. That's the second pillar. The third pillar is ethical wealth creation. And here, I want to spend some time explaining this, because this is oftentimes very misunderstood in India. We think about, and I think given our socialist past, typically we think about wealth as, and wealth creators as maybe as a necessary evil, not as ones that are actually, providing a big service to the country. And here I want to draw on, because we started out talking about my childhood and, so I want to give you a specific, anecdote, an example. So as I mentioned, we came from a lower middle class.
Can I interrupt you first?
Yes.
In page 179, which when you talk about the socialist past, about wealth creators being seen as evil. Today I've had a spat on Twitter about this. So I'm going to read out this one part in which you write, given India's socialist past, some of us perceive wealth creators and act of wealth creation as evil. Have you ever wondered who provides more jobs and thereby helps to sustain the livelihoods of families, the wealthy or the poor person? And then you go on to talk about the bane of dwarfism and its impact, where you say the significant impact of the curse of dwarfs on Indian economy, hindering both job creation and productivity. I'm just how you talk about small firms that have less than 99 employees. They account for 83% of all firms in India by number, and their share in employment is just 21.5%.
Correct.
And then you go on to say that dwarfs account for 58% of all firms in India, but the number and their share in employment is just 14.8%. The dwarfs remain the lowest per capita contributors to employment and productivity in the economy. So now you tell me about what the anecdote that you were talking about.
So that anecdote relates to the first part that you read out,
the
which
socialist
is,
part.
Thinking about wealth and wealth creators as essentially as evil, right?
Yeah.
So I want to give 2 specific, examples to anchor this. First, as I mentioned, I come from a lower middle class family. Some months we used to actually have a house help who would come and, help my mother actually, wash dishes for us. Now, this lady used to work not only in our family, but she used to work in 9 other families. In other words, a lower middle class family like us, which was not creating that much wealth, was providing 1/10 of a household helps job. Okay. In contrast, the jeweler, who was basically the richest man in our town, he had, between his business and his home, he used to have about 100 people working for him. And these were people who actually were earning much higher than the house help. He was creating wealth, of course, through his, at that time, actually, I didn't understand. Maybe I might have said things sort of not very flattering things about him. But as an economist, now I understand that, his wealth creation actually is providing so much jobs, 100 people. So in terms of quantity of jobs, the lower middle class family providing just 1/10 of a job, while the wealth creator providing 100 jobs means 1,000 times more wealth creation in quantity. Not just that, in quality, if you look at the wages, basically, those people were paid at least 5-6 times that of a house help. So that's my first example. Clearly see the correlation between
which is mentioned in your book also.
Yeah. Second, actually, and this is something which I say with absolute conviction, one of the things I've been very careful about is to not do any consulting for any industrialist, so that I can offer my independent thought. And with this, let me say, take any industrialist, XYZ, okay? Their wealth, are they actually stacking it as rupee bills in their pillows and their mattresses and sleeping on them? That's a question that I want to ask. They are putting it in companies. If you take any and I think this example, I've put it, elsewhere as well. Take Infosys, for instance, right? In the late 80s, when Infosys was started, basically 6 people had started the firm. Nandan Nilekani, Narayan Murthy sir and Nandan Nilekani and others. Today, they employ millions of people. Right? So it's a firm that actually, and they've created so much wealth. Or take any of the startups, for Swiggy, for instance. Today, because of Swiggy, there are so many people who are getting jobs who might have been possibly doing other...
Zomato, Flipkart, so many.
I mean, we can keep talking about it, right? I think the point, and this is because there is a lot of rhetoric on this, and this rhetoric, especially political rhetoric, which talks about, which demeans oftentimes wealth creators, and they do that only because most of us don't understand this nuance. If common people understand this nuance, that wealth creators actually also provide very important service in providing jobs, then I think political rhetoric basically cannot sort of try and pull wool on our eyes.
So I'm going to again take out what I found it very interesting. In page 282, 283, where Tiruvalluvar you quote, and you say, wealth the lamp, unfailing, speed to every land, dispersing darkness at its Lord's command. And you say that, then you go on to write and quote it, says, make money, there is no weapon sharper than it to serve the pride of your foes.
To sever the pride.
Please understand, Despite such a rich tradition of emphasizing wealth creation, India deviated from this model for several decades after independence. We had the culture of valuing wealth creators, but then we started calling them names. We started pulling them down. During our socialist era. Now you are a product of liberalization. I was born in the socialist era. I am from an era where people saw an Ambani as an upstart. My parents are from an era who saw Tata Birla as people who were bad people. And then I'm not saying my parents did, I'm saying they belong to an era. अपने आप को टाटा बिरला समझते हैं क्या? Subsequently it became अपने आप को अंबानी अडानी समझता है क्या? The idea is always that they are wrong people, that they have bent rules, that they not appreciating. Of course, everybody would want their kids to be employed by an Ambani Adani, but
or maybe become one of them.
Become one of them. Yes, correct. So talk to me about this aspect.
No, I think you've asked a very, very good question. There are at least 2-3 aspects that I want to focus on. Firstly, I think let me give you a couple of very sort of simple examples, right? You might have an altar at home, where we, let's say, keep some God's photographs and we do puja, etc., right? What do we write there? We write Shubh Labh. Do we write Shubh Hani? Or do we write Ashubh and Labh? No, we don't. We write Shubh Labh. It says, do good and actually make profit out of that. That is our culture, number one. Number two, if you look at the 4 purusharths that are talked about, basic dharma, arth, kama, moksha. earth, what is earth? It's basically wealth. And and for instance, if you go back to the Rig Veda, which is basically known one of the oldest documents, right? There is a Sri Suktam, which is actually a hymn to the goddess of wealth, Lakshmi. And that is our culture, where we actually talk about do good and and become prosperous in that. And I think that is what Tiruvalluvar 3,500 years is talking about. He's saying actually that wealth creation is that lamp that basically dispels poverty, the darkness of poverty. That is in the south. In the north, you have actually Chanakya actually Kautilya and talking about importance. He says he exhorts the king, saying, remove all obstacles to economic activity. What is that but ease of doing business? So this is 2,500 years back. And that chapter actually I start by first using Angus Madison's research, who looked at 2,000 years of economic history and showed that India accounted for at least 1/3 of world's GDP up until 1750 AD. Now, there was those who basically don't want to accept this. They'll say, oh, but India's GDP, it was because of population, etc. The fact I want to mention there is, during those times, populations moved to places which had prosperity. It wasn't actually an accident. Populations, and so, we cannot just dismiss it. Therefore, population was something that was actually endogenous. And that's why, it is important to keep in mind that India was a very prosperous, and that prosperity came from actually, thinking that was advocated by a Kautilya, in the north, by a Tiruvalluvar in the south. Therefore, I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that the socialist, mindset, was basically trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And it was borrowed from the West. If you think about it, these ideas of communism, socialism, etc., those are not Indian ideas. They were actually came from Europe. And we ended up trying to fit that to a culture that actually prided itself on entrepreneurship. Even today, for instance, I have again no hesitation. If we basically ease doing business and remove some of the shackles that we have on our entrepreneurs among the best in the world. Look at the kind of, I think the best example of that is look at the kind of Indians who actually have gone and created, whether it's a Satya Nadella, whether it's actually they've all created such beautiful, that shows the kind of potential. So I think socialism is something that we have to...
in this, socialism, I'm going to come to that when I talk about the financial misreporting business. I'm going to come back to that. Before that, I had read out this part about the curse of the dwarfs.
Dwarfism, yes.
Can you just explain that to me?
So let me go back to that example that I gave you of Infosys, right? Infosys was a child, an infant in the late 80s that has grown to be a giant and has created so much jobs in the process, right? In contrast, if you take a firm that, let's say, was, in the late 80s was 5-6 people, but has only grown to maybe have, 90 people or 95 people, that firm has not created, jobs. It is one that has grown in age but has not grown in size, and that is why I basically call it the phenomenon of
and the
dwarfs.
NPAs that come
yes,
as a result
many of
that.
Those actually it's not as productive because it hasn't grown its scale. Economies of scale enables firms to reduce their costs. They become more productive and they provide jobs. And I think one of the other aspects that I show in this as evidence of the phenomenon of dwarfism, if you compare India versus the US, plot on the x-axis just basically firm age, as a firm ages. Take a 5-year-old firm in India and the US and make them start at the same point, saying that let's say they have 100 employees. Average firm has 100 employees, 5-year-old firm. Then run this race. As time passes, how many jobs are they creating by the time they're 30-year-old on average? In the United States, and there's a very nice academic research that has shown that shows that in the US, that 5-year-old firm that had 100 employees has on average now 700 employees when it is 30-year-old. In India, that same number is only 140. In other words,
despite automation there and lack of automation here.
Yes, this is over despite so much technology, right? Technological progress. 7 times as much jobs being created by a 30-year-old firm in the US compared to a 5-year-old firm. In India, it's only 40% more. And then think about actually why are we not, we've had this period of especially up until 2014, we haven't created as much jobs with growth.
So it's the march of the dwarfs because of
exactly
Okay.
So and this is something. I'll give you a very tangible policy example here. Take labor laws, for instance. The legislation has been passed in 2020, but we still, because the rules have not been passed yet, we still are in the old dispensation, where when a firm becomes, has more than 100 employees, the entire rule book is basically thrown to, in terms of labor laws, is thrown at them. If you're a 95 employee firm, then you don't have as much compliance to do. But if you're a 100 employee, you get basically.
You're done. Yeah.
So what does the entrepreneur do? And for instance, if I were, he or she is a rational person, when the firm basically goes and becomes about 95, 96, that's when he starts remembering his brother-in-law, maybe his, driver, because he wants to start a firm, maybe in his wife's name, his brother-in-law's name, because he doesn't want to, have that entire compliance of, becoming a 100 employee firm. If for instance, this actually is increased to 500, let's say, right?
Yeah.
This threshold, that any firm that is less than 500 employees does not have to, then what will happen actually, that threshold will go to 495 maybe.
Yeah.
And you will have firms basically growing at least to 500. But in the United States, they don't have these kind of, regulations. It's these regulations that basically, actually encourage this phenomenon of the shackling.
Yeah.
They're not, because, for instance, if you have 5 firms, each of whom are about, slightly less than 100 employees, compared to one firm that is 500 employees, that 500 employee firm has scale, and therefore it is able to reduce its costs. It can compete better with, with global firms, and it is creating far more employment. So this statistic that I gave you for the United States, firms are basically growing and thereby creating a lot more jobs because their regulation does not encourage dwarfism. Here, in contrast, we do. And I think another piece of evidence actually I've shown, using the Rajasthan, the labor law change actually, where clearly factories have grown in size. They actually have value. And so we have evidence why, people will say, United States actually is not comparable. I genuinely believe it is. But even from, Rajasthan in India itself, the evidence is there. Absolutely. If we basically remove some of these shackles, we will have better job creation and thereby, also productivity growth, and they'll become much more competitive as well.
So you talk about economic freedom and wealth creation, how we need this is in the chapter Liberating the Economy. You're saying Indian economy is replete with examples where government intervenes even if there is no risk of market failure. And in fact, in some instances, its intervention has created market failures. This may partly be due to the legacy of post-independence economic policies that the country followed. Tell me now how and where and when.
So I want to take the example of agriculture. It's a fact and an unfortunate fact in our country that every other producer, and a farmer is also a producer, is a producer of food, right? Every other producer, it could be the producer of this suit or that sari that you're, wearing, ma'am, can go and sell his produce wherever he or she wants. It's only the small farmer who cannot go and, sell his or her produce wherever he or she wants. And the simple fact is, and actually there's I've seen this because I come from sort of these small towns, etc., and I've been there. So if you take, for instance, a small farmer, when he wants to sell his produce, what does he do? He hires a tractor tailor to come and sell his produce in the mandi where he can go and sell. He comes up early in the morning, 8 o'clock. The intermediate, who's called an arhatya, knows very well that this small farmer cannot go anywhere else. Actually, he's beholden to that. So what does he do? He makes him wait. Wait. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, by this time the farmer is actually frustrated. He's, if it is basically vegetables, etc., wo sadne lage hain. He's scared about ki kal dobara lana hai kya. He doesn't want to get it. So what does he do? When it is 3, 4, and the intermediary also knows by that time, if he tests his patient, he'll basically be willing to sell at any price. As a result, what happens actually, if you look at the data supposes as well, that of 100 rupees of value added that is, created, the small farmer gets only 10 rupees. The 90 rupees goes to the now, if you think about it, it's basically where I'm talking about the intervention. If we, and this is what the farm laws try to do, right? If, for instance, the small farmer just has the opportunity, he doesn't even need to actually, if he can say, for instance, if he has the opportunity to go and go to the closest mandi, nearby mandi, and sell there, he just needs to tell this arhatya, saying, By the time he's basically waited for an hour, says, "Saab, आपको खरीदना है तो खरीदिए, नहीं तो मैं बगल वाले मंडी में जाता हूँ," right? Just that threat, and that threat is a credible one. He'll say, "मैं खरीद लेता हूँ." Because now, in the current situation, that threat is an empty one.
Yeah.
But if with this basically freedom for the small farmer to go and sell where he or she wants, he has a credible threat, and now he will not be, he's not frustrated to actually sell. He will get a much better share. He'll get 50 rupees, and that is what will really lead to the small farmer's income going up, and the intermediary will not be cornering large part of the share. Another example, let me give you here.
The government couldn't do it. Had to take it back. And even now,
yes,
just one comment is enough. And plus, by the time we air this, it's possibly going to impact on the election in another state, where the perception that the government wanted to do this.
No, I think this is so. I have to mention this, that agriculture is a state subject. Okay, that was the point that was mentioned, right?
Yeah.
It was mentioned that this is basically a case of the center, let's say stepping into shoes, etc. Well, let's take that argument forward. In that case, if basically it is a power of the states to actually implement agricultural reform, then power and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. So then let's take this argument forward to its logical conclusion and say, why don't states do it now? Why, for all the rhetoric that they spew about the small farmer, why don't they provide this freedom? I think it is just common sense, Smita ji, right? That if this freedom is provided, when that freedom is there to every other producer in this country, even for instance those that, if you want to say, take somebody who gives milk, right? Are we saying that the milk producer can go and sell only to a particular set of families?
Dairy farmers, because of the cooperative system,
do
make more money. I
agree.
As compared to the small farmers.
Correct.
Which is like you're talking about 70% of farmers or 80% are small farmers.
Yes, exactly. No, what I'm talking about actually is the giving them the freedom to go and sell where they want.
Correct.
That is something which is singularly missing for the small farmer, and especially those that are under the ambit of the APMC, right? One more example I want to give you, which is because many of these were enacted during the socialist era, the Essential Commodities Act, and this is something which, so it's important to understand, it's just plain common sense that when it comes to agriculture, farming, right, supply is seasonal. When the kharif crop comes, actually maybe a couple of months, that's when a lot of supply, all rice, everything, all the kharif crops. But demand is all through the year, because we have to eat all through the year, right? When supply is seasonal and when demand is all through the year, what do? You have to store. Right? You have to store. And let me give you, to basically anchor this idea, let me take the example of achar that we make, right? If we basically aam ka achar banate hain, so aam actually comes only in the summer, but our grandmothers, etc., they understood actually, and therefore, its supply comes during summer, supply of achar. We store it all through the year. It has enough oil so that we can store. Storage is intrinsic to agriculture, to farming produce, because supply is seasonal and demand is all through the year. And yet, what do? The Essential Commodities Act, which is passed in the early 60s, equates all storage as hoarding. And I'm sure you will remember, Bollywood has played its role as well. You would remember that character Jeevan, right? He would basically be shown as somebody who's actually hoarding. He's storing, right? And we equate that to hoarders.
A villain.
A villain, hoarders. And actually this is a case where there's absolutely no reason for intervention.
It was a criminal violation. I remember in the 70s, people were arrested and things like that. Exactly.
And and I've provided evidence actually how most of these cases that are filed, they don't result in any because they're just harassment, in fact. Now, as a result, what has happened is that storage infrastructure cold storage in particular, has not grown in the country. Now, who does this hurt the most? It's a small farmer. Why?
Perishables.
See, basically, if for instance, and think about the counterfactual,
tomatoes or whatever.
He actually, suppose, let's say there was an industry, who could actually provide high quality storage. The small farmer would rent that and actually keep that. His, let's say, rice has come, whatever he has kept it for his own consumption, rest of it goes and puts it in storage. And then 3 months, 4 months later, when prices have gone up because supply demand mismatch has gotten reduced, actually he can go and sell that and get much better price. That doesn't happen. The large farmer, on the other hand, actually has the deep pockets to go and create his own, cold storage infrastructure. So he or she can go and sell it when the price is higher. So if you think about it, all these laws actually really hurt the small farmer. And I think it is really important to understand. That is why, it was unfortunate, but I think the small farmers need to be thought as the labharthis. And it is now the onus is on states, because if they said that, okay, it is our power to actually go and
then do it.
Then do it. Yes, then do it actually. And I hope those who are hearing can see how commonsensical this is, that just provide these. This is simple. You don't need an economist like me to actually tell you these things. I think, you
do. I'll tell you why. I think with the farm laws, the problem was in not explaining it properly and to just bring it on suddenly. A lot of government decision is if you don't take people on board and you don't explain how it benefits, it causes trouble. And there's also, intrinsically there are bodies who benefit from the old laws.
Yeah, there are people who benefit from the status quo.
So disruption is always difficult to accept for certain power.
Correct. In fact, that's a good point you're bringing up. Actually, I want to sort of expand on it a little bit, because when we think about the political economy of reforms, right? It's, I want to actually use the example of, I'm sure you might have done this too. We've all traveled in unreserved compartments, in Indian Railways, right?
Yes.
I've traveled too, actually. Yes. But I think that is a metaphor I want to use to explain reforms. What happens if, suppose, let's say, take for instance Kalka Mail. If you got into the third class compartment, the unreserved compartment in Delhi, then you are lucky you will reach basically Howrah. Okay, but and I've tried that to basically, sometimes when I didn't have reservation, when I used to be and I was studying at that time, to try and get in at Kanpur, you cannot get in into an unreserved bogie in Kanpur,
I think I've
Allahabad.
Done it on Frontier Mail, if I'm not mistaken. There used to be a horrible train called Frontier Mail.
Yes.
To Bombay.
Yes. To Bombay. I think Delhi to Bombay, right?
So Delhi, Bombay.
So, the reason is, now the fact is there are many people who actually also want to reach their destinations. But those who have gotten in initially, they are not allowing others to come in. And that is basically the example that I want to give. There are those who are benefiting from the status quo. In this case, that status quo is basically those who have gotten into that, that third class compartment, right?
And that fight.
That fight. And this is where it is important to understand that in a democracy, and this is where those who actually benefit from status quo obviously they've benefited and they've become richer. And therefore, they have the deep pockets. They also have the voice to be able to reach and, shout, and basically make their argument very, very loudly. But those who will benefit from from this are small people who actually have lost from the status quo. Therefore, they are poor. There are also people who actually, they want to go and earn their living every day. They can't come and actually, and basically voice their opinion as much. That's why what happens is for reforms, even though, the reforms really benefit the large section of, of basically, many times they don't even understand that the reform is going to help them.
I remember the license control Raj, right? When I started my career, there was just one person in media. Today, what we are today is because media opened up.
Exactly.
Thankfully. But look at the trouble that Dr. Manmohan Singh almost lost his government when he wanted to bring about reforms. Narasimha Rao faced a lot of resentment because obviously
Atal Bihari Vajpayee
so all these guys,
PM as well, PM Modi
and now Narendra Modi, right? So there are times when these bold decisions almost lead to loss of government. And I mean, for a nuclear deal to go through, and Amar Singh was relied upon, right? People have forgotten that era.
Correct.
That, to save a government, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who's like revered as this economist, needed an Amar Singh, a non-economist, to save his government.
In fact, actually, I think the most compelling example we have is of liberalization, right? And I give almost all the credit to P.V. Narasimha Rao for actually having done that. What did he do? And I think this is something that's been documented.
I wouldn't be where we are. This podcast wouldn't be happening.
Exactly. If telecom, for instance, but for the telecom revolution, we wouldn't have this.
No, we wouldn't.
We basically would have had those phones that we would have. And across sectors, take airlines, for instance.
So today, if we revile Sam Pitroda for all kinds of things he does, because he was part of the telecom mission.
Indeed, actually. And I think, and we need to give credit for where it is due. But the point I want to highlight, take liberalization, right? There are people, and because I used to follow, I was studying at that time. I remember, sitting in the reading room of IIT Kanpur and reading about liberalization. There were those who were basically saying, Swadeshi and this and that. Why? Yeah. Because they were those actually, their product would actually be competed upon by global products. And that's why these were those that had benefited from the status quo of the socialist economy. And they were the ones that were voicing the most against liberalization. In fact, I think, as I said, this is written upon. There were people, the Prime Minister then had to endure opposition from within his own party. Yeah. Right? There are, I don't want to get into names, but actually there are people whom we know about who were part of, who basically opposed liberalization at that point in time.
At every juncture, whether it was Rajiv Gandhi, there were cartoons I remember made Computer G. Yeah. Because he used to say computerization will be brought in. So he was laughed at for that. Yes. Then came the other prime ministers, including this, why Chidambaram, which we recently saw when he said UPI will not work, will we, how will a village woman, exact quote I don't remember, but he said that.
He said that actually, I think, let me give you using data so that our people understand, right? This is a statistic I just basically found, some days back. In 1947, India's GDP per capita in dollar terms, nominal dollars, was 2,730. 9,000 rupees was the, per capita in rupee terms. The exchange rate was about 3.3. So, 9,000 divided by 3.3 is 2,730. From 2,030, socialist model brought that down to $300 per capita by 1991. So everyone who actually, talks about basically, a socialism, etc., they need to understand that and they need to explain to me, how do you, from 2,700, you decrease the per capita GDP by 9 times to $300. The liberalization that has happened, and actually I give credit to P.V. Narasimha Rao, Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji and Modi ji actually for a lot of the reforms that have happened, has raised it back again from $300 to 2,730. 2024 GDP per capita, IMF data is India's GDP per capita is 2,730. In other words, we've had a V-shaped actually,
which you mentioned.
We have that V-shape is actually I've talked about in the COVID context of COVID. Yeah. But there's a V-shaped actually in our 75-year-old existence itself, where from 2,730 we came down to 300 in 1991 because of the socialist era policies, and from 300 we have again gone back to 2,730. So I think this is what better evidence than actually how, if you don't enable competition, if you basically keep restricted, like in agriculture, then you will actually have, this is what agriculture has not grown because of all these policies. So, you talked about media, I mentioned about telecom, airlines, sector after sector. I think the one lesson that we can take is that competition and healthy competition is what builds capabilities. It basically enhances overall welfare. If there is one thing that economists really, do not disagree on, it is the benefits of competition. And that is why actually I can tell you, when I was in the 2021 economic survey, I had written actually of all those economists who had, when they were in positions of power, they had written supporting the farm bill. They have, and I've actually documented that. And yet when it came to actually when the farm bill was implemented, they sang a different tune. And I think which was extremely unfortunate, because these economists, I'm sure, would agree that the farm bills actually would have enhanced competition. And in fact, all this talk about corporatism, etc., I think, again, common sense we can use to understand. If corporates being there actually has not hurt small producers of this coat or maybe any small produce, why is it that it should hurt basically, just farmers? Isn't it against common sense to ask this question?
Entrenched lobbies.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you on this, it's in page 294, 295 for those who are buying the book or have bought the book. I'm going to read out a paragraph and you can expand on this. The government needs to support the moral hand by being a good referee of the economy.
Yes.
The referee's job is not only to report but also detect opportunistic behavior of people are not No, the referee's job is to not only report but also detect opportunistic behavior if people are not playing by the rules.
Yeah.
Like willful defaults, malpractices such as financial misreporting and market manipulation. They need to be detected early because these termites that eat away investors' faith in financial markets, diminish portfolio investments, and crowd out important national investments. They scare away scrupulous and law abiding market participants and drive away investments and therefore jobs in the economy. To fittingly celebrate wealth creators who make wealth ethically, it is of utmost importance that our financial markets are fair and transparent. In this, the state's role as a competent referee cannot be overemphasized.
Absolutely. And
This part,
something.
this part
Yes.
I need, because even if people take time to read, I've just pointed out a few things which I want you to.
No, first of all, let me thank you. I think you've read it with so much care. So
Okay.
I really appreciate that. I think this is the other very important part of, when I mentioned competition, I mentioned actually healthy competition, right? And I think this is really, and that's where the referee, for instance, if you take any sporting match, right, there's always a referee to ensure that there is fair competition. What you don't want is basically a rule of the jungle. In the jungle, basically the mighty eats the weak, right? That's not what what a good economy should be. And I think here we have to understand that those who are incumbents, they have the deep pockets, and they can oftentimes actually they can align aspects of whether it's actually it could be any it could be, for instance, let's say audit firms, it could be investment bankers, and maybe others. Actually they can align to their benefit. I'll give you the example of there's a case study that we learned in business school. This was the case study of Nirma. When Nirma came in washing powder, this is actually in the late 80s. It was a startup, and there was a lot of obstacles.
Unilever and the others.
Yes, basically, for instance. And
I studied that
yes,
too.
right.
Yes.
There was predatory pricing that was indulged in at that point in time.
Yeah.
Why? Because Nirma did not have the deep pockets, and at that time, if for instance, and the prices were reduced so much that Nirma could not have competed. That was unhealthy competition, right? That needed a good referee to say this is not something, this kind of unhealthy competition is basically not. It has to be healthy competition. Now, it's a good, we are here to talk about the story of Nirma because Karsan Bhai Patel, who actually on his bicycle, he went and gave it to all the the grihinis.
Point of purchase. He went to point of purchase and
exactly
gave it.
Point of purchase and gave it, and the word of mouth spread, and that is why we have actually Nirma today, right?
Yeah.
Now that is an example.
And also he used advertising creatively,
exactly,
as compared to Unilever, which was like doing it in a particular manner.
So I want to use this example to illustrate that actually, when incumbents try to, actually muzzle down, let's say, entrants, then it has two effects. One, of course, that particular incumbent dies down and does not challenge the incumbent. More importantly, what happens is then the threat is created for every other incumbent saying, if you come in, I'm going to muzzle like this, right? And that then reduces competition. And this is a very important idea that, we need to have in mind. The referee, therefore, needs to play saying this is, we cannot let basically muzzling happen. I think this is where I'm really happy to, state that over the last 10 years, for instance, look at the entrepreneurial ecosystem the way it has grown. From 2004 to 2014, I'm using World Bank data, the rate of new firm creation was 3.2% annually. It grew at 3.2%. From 2014 onwards, it has grown at almost 200%. As a result, we have the third largest, entrepreneurial ecosystem in the world with more than 120 unicorns, right? And that has happened because of ease of doing business has improved. There's a long way to go. Let me not. We still have a lot of work to do, as Swami Vivekananda said, actually miles to go before we sleep. Or, I think he basically said, we cannot, arise awake and, stop not till the dream is achieved. So that's so I think we still have a long way to go here. But there has been improvement, and that is what has actually led to entrepreneurial firm creation. Because for me, the vibrancy of an economy is actually seen in the way in which startups are enabled. Because that is actually showing whether the referee is able to do his or her job better, well or not. Compared to earlier, it has improved, but there's still a long way to go. And I want to give you a specific example. Focus on auditors.
Okay.
Because auditors are the...
Yeah, I'm going to come to auditors and judiciary.
Yes.
Both who you mentioned.
Yes. Auditors are the first line of defense, for anybody who wants to invest in a firm, because an investor looks at the financial statements and then decides whether he or she wants to actually he or she trust the numbers. If, for instance, he sees that and later he finds out skeletons in the closet that are not revealed in the financial statements, that leads to loss of trust in the system, right? And this is the way one episode actually has it creates a negative environment everywhere, and that's why auditors have a very, very important job to do in our country. And I think if we look at, I think whether it was the willful defaulter phenomenon or even Satyam, for instance, or in the US, etc., as well, Enron, I think auditors have been culpable of not basically doing their best due diligence in revealing, all the aspects of, putting out all the skeletons that are in the closet. So here, I want to give a specific example, and this is something that is absolutely important to focus, because I speak about this based on my experience of being part of the Uday Kotak Corporate Governance Committee of SEBI. There are what are called related party transactions. Related party, and for the benefit of viewers, let me explain. Let's say if you have two firms who are, let's say, who are related. For instance, it could be that you start a firm and maybe your brother also has a firm, and you are related, so that's why actually those are related firms, right? So if there is a transaction that is done, let's say, maybe just for the purpose of the example, let's say your brother has a firm that is, let's say, builds buildings, and you say, okay, hey, my brother, can you build a building for me? I want to build a bigger studio. So obviously you will pay him, right? And he will receive payment. You're making a payment. That's a related party transaction. Now this related party transaction actually needs to be disclosed properly in the financial statements, especially if you've taken money from investors, where it could be debt investors or equity investors. You need to reveal that, right? What happens, and actually we looked at this, the quality of related party transaction disclosures actually can be significantly improved. When we looked at, I think this was for a particular year, when we looked at even among NSE 500 firms, this is an aspect that actually significantly can be improved. Many times what happens is that, either one of the firm does not disclose it, or the transactions are disclosed by both firms, but the amounts don't match, and in systematic ways. What is that systematic way? Where the seller basically usually underreports, so that his revenues actually is lower, and the buyer overreports, so that his costs are higher. This is an aspect. Who's responsible for this? It is the audit firm. And I think so. Quality of related party transaction disclosures, in particular, for instance, if you look at willful default, and that's something which I have studied.
This comes under willful default.
Yes, because willful.
How do you prove willful default?
The Reserve Bank of India has a full definition for actually. So they
have what I mean in this related party.
Yes, so the way it happens oftentimes actually, and I've looked at that. I have a draft of a book written on this itself on willful defaulters. So typically, suppose let's say I have. Let's say I maybe don't have great intent of repaying. Suppose, let's say, what do? I borrow a loan, in the balance sheet of my firm, and then I do transactions with basically a related party. As a result, what do? I'm actually effectively transferring, wealth and profits away from this particular firm to the other firm on which I have not borrowed. So this firm, I effectively am sort of, stripping it away. Yeah. And, and so money has gone into the other firm, which is effectively like the bank account of the, and as a result, this firm has become as defaults, but money is lying elsewhere. As a result, we've had this
promoter. I'm still
we've had this during this episode. We had the phenomenon of bankrupt companies, but uber rich promoters. Yeah, and that happened through related party transactions. Yeah. So one of the key things in financial markets is that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Disclosure. I think, emphasis on disclosure, especially on related party transactions. Why? Because about 50% of our activity in India actually comes through, through conglomerates, and promoter-driven groups, which actually have many different firms, all of which actually are mostly related parties, right? So I think disclosure, quality of disclosure is extremely important here. So part of the refereeing process is to make sure that the quality of disclosure actually is improved. And here, I think NFRA now actually, NFRA is actually playing an important role in making sure that quality of these disclosures is enhanced.
So, role of auditors, let me come to this chapter called Reclaiming Justice, the urgency for judicial reform. I thought that the third term of the Modi government will result in a whole lot of reforms and all, but seems, at least at this stage, that judicial reforms like police reforms may not happen. At least now we're again one nation, one election not happening. We are going into election mode continuously 4 months after the general elections. So anyway, I'm going to read out this part where you say economic activity is affected by the long shadow of delays and pendency across the legal landscape. Now, everybody knows about pendency and the need for changes to happen and for us to quickly reform. Now, in this, you say that clearing the legal logjam. First is to achieve a 100% clearance rate so that there's no accumulation of pending cases. And the second is to remove the backlog of cases already present in the system.
Yeah.
How important is this for economic activity now?
I think it's absolutely critical because, in any economy, enforcement of contracts is actually really critical for economic activity. And here, whenever I think about, the judicial delays, I'm reminded of this wonderful movie, Damini. Remember, Sunny Deol thundering in the courtroom saying, Tariq pe Tariq, Tariq pe Tariq, Tariq pe Tariq, Judge Saab, mili hai to sirf Tariq, insaf nahi, right? I think that exemplifies, and this dialogue was about maybe in the 90s, maybe.
Yeah,
I think 90s, right? We are still talking about that. In fact, we wrote about this in the 2018-19 economic survey. At that time, actually, compared to that, the backlog has actually increased significantly. I think by about 30-odd%.
The CJI said that.
Yes. So
everybody knows about it.
Exactly. But I think, and that's where I have tried to, analyze and using the latest data, I think it is important to recognize that the problem is not as insurmountable as it seems. The first thing is to ensure, 100% case clearance rate. If the case
pendency in December 2023 is 4.49 crores. I mean, it's bizarre.
4.5 crores.
So
yeah.
to dispose of these cases will take what, a decade? I think it's not going to happen.
It can actually
at the current pace.
Yes, in fact, but it won't happen with just status quo. I think that is an important point I want to make.
Yeah.
As I said, so there are, and you read out very well, there are two parts, right? One is to ensure there is no hereafter accumulation of cases, for which the case clearance rate being at least 100% is by far the most important. What do we need to do that? I think
summer vacation. The summer vacation. End the summer vacation.
That is one solution, of course, but there are other solutions as well. No, I think I would want to take that up seriously as well.
You need more vacation benches.
Maybe that actually, but let me focus on. See, if you look at the backlogs and overall, 85% of these are in the district and the sessions courts, right? And if we just ensure that the sanction strength, judges are basically appointed to the sanctions. We don't need to increase the sanction strength at all. We just make sure that vacancies are filled. That will ensure that the case clearance rate is 100%. That's one of the key parts basically taken care of. So that, there is no further accumulation. The second part is then basically decumulation, reducing the backlog, for which, again, if we can actually appoint judges, I think that, especially at the district and sessions courts, because, think about the common person, right? A lot of them really deal with the judiciary at the sessions court level, at the district court level. If we can use technology here, and I think this is where the judicial, administrative service, I think, may be very important. The judges, we can have actually things like use of technology to be able to, for instance, when in the US and others, we have what is called LexisNexis, right? Now, LexisNexis, basically, you want to search any case, actually, you want to bring, because common law operates based on prior evidence, right? You get the entire list. why can't we actually build a LexisNexis, in vernacular language, main languages?
Yeah.
Why? Because sessions courts many times use actually.
Hasn't it already started?
I think some work is being done, and I think
yeah.
but I think this needs to happen actually at war war pace actually.
Yeah,
I think,
but in a country where how many languages do we have? Fights or
but now AI, you have actually the benefit of AI.
Correct.
You have the benefit of AI being able to do translation, etc. I think AI, in my opinion, actually, especially for a multilingual country like India, can be a huge boon. We need to avail that benefit.
So long as learning models incorporate all that complexities of legal issues.
Yes, I think which can be done. I think it's just
yes, of course.
All one needs actually is, for instance, there should be, like the GSTN, there should be an independent entity that is created.
You're going into a minefield area on GST.
No, I'm not going to GSTN. I'm actually drawing inspiration from there, actually, where it's a public-private partnership where you have lawyers and you have technological people as well, so that the combination of that, you enable, the equivalent of LexisNexis, so that, and not just that, automation of all the procedures. A lot of the procedures that can be automated. In fact, there are countries like Singapore which actually use AI even for case disposal for a lot of the routine cases. If it is just about, let's say, a traffic violation or something, some of these simple, then those basically there is enough precedent to be able to, you don't need or it's a land dispute, for instance, right? There is enough precedent of that. There's so much data that can be drawn upon by AI to come up with you feed it and the judgment comes through. That the judge maybe doesn't have to write it himself. He goes through it, corrects aspects that are actually need to be corrected. A lot of his work is saved. He becomes far more productive. And so using this, productivity can be enhanced, and therefore backlogs can be reduced. I think
who would have thought that because of COVID and because of that time period, you can now do on camera and so many things which have changed, right? Long distance fighting cases. Everything has changed.
Correct. In fact, I want to give an example here. Around 2016-17 at the Indian School of Business, because ISB started in collaboration with Kellogg and Wharton, had suggested this idea: why don't we have seminars that are basically where people from Kellogg and Wharton can also join on video conference? That idea was poo-pooed at that time, because maybe the time was not right, but today that is actually a reality. We interact across the globe. I've done, for instance, during the time of the budget, I've done interviews sitting in Washington DC.
Correct.
So I think that can be utilized. In other words, I have no hesitation in saying here that where there is a will, there is a way.
Correct.
I think here people need to come together, I think, to make sure, because this is by far the best boon that we can give to the next generation, if we can really ensure that the backlog of cases is taken care of, because the effect of that will be people will basically not act with impunity. They will basically know that take, for instance, let me take the example of I think there was this case of I think Jagdish Tytler on the right. That happened, the episode happened in 1984. 40 years it's taken for judgment.
Charges are going to be formulated.
Yes, 40 years. 40, I think, right? Now, if for instance, let's say, if whoever it was, if they basically knew that you could face punishment for this in just 6 months, they would have not had that kind of impunity at that point in time, right? I think the point I want to make actually, Smita, here is that the deterrent effect that it creates, that is a really big impact, and that will actually have an impact on behavior itself. Rule of law will become much better, and even for instance in corporate aspects as well, frauds and many of the willful default, all these actually will reduce significantly. So I think if there is one aspect that the economy really needs, it is enforcement of contracts. And here I think we've basically, in the World Bank rankings, we were ranked 164 out of 180 countries. I think being in the bottom quartile, or maybe is something that actually that doesn't suit a country that is the 5th largest economy and aspires to become the the 3rd largest.
We were talking about Chidambaram making that point about UPI. Can you talk about some of these path-making things which in your time you have seen? Game changer things. Absolutely. Like which you have seen. Can you just?
I think on especially on the digital infrastructure. Because I happen to be on the board of IMF, I oftentimes remind my colleagues that We've created, in India, bank accounts that is actually about 1.5 times that the population of the United States. 500 million plus bank accounts. And I think that, during COVID, for instance, that was such a big boon because, money was transferred to people just with a click. Think about it actually. If suppose, let's say, those bank accounts were not created, you would have had to actually print checks, maybe, or send, maybe cash, right? Have to give that. And think about the super spreader phenomenon that we have created because people have had to line up to actually get that cash or maybe get the checks, etc. Checks, wouldn't have reached in time. So I think that, again, the counterfactual tells you about the enormous impact that this had. Similarly, if you take the digital transactions, I think for the benefit of our viewers, I want to mention this. If you put the number of digital transactions, that happen in a day in India on one side of a balance, on the other side of the balance, first put the number of digital transactions that happen in the United States, India will actually be far heavier. So add to that, number of transactions that happen in a day in Europe, India will still be heavier. Then again, add to that the number of digital transactions that happen in China. All three of them put together, still India will be heavier. That's the kind of, that's a transformation actually. And as somebody who's an engineer, when I love technology and applying technology for
you
welfare,
write that in the book too.
For welfare. And I think this is such a brilliant example of, of technology. And I think I have, once again here, I have no hesitation in saying, actually, I was really impressed by, the Honorable Prime Minister, the way he understands the power of technology. And I think a lot of these initiatives have happened because of his, understanding of technology and implementing this. So this now needs to be, we've done the plumbing now. We now really need to build on this, especially, for instance, I want to take in the, on credit creation, for instance, right? If you look at the percentage of credit that is given, about 90% of credit is actually based on collateral. You have to put up your land, or maybe factory, etc. But we have the data today, right? We have the account aggregator, we have the UPI, we have OCN, all of these actually, and we have fintech firms who are ready to mine this data. We need to expand credit using just cash flows, basically. For instance, and let me give you a tangible example. We go across, let's say, walk across to Sarojini Nagar here. Maybe 10 years back, if I went to Sarojini Nagar, or maybe you had gone, if you wanted to buy a bag, let's say a wallet or something, right, you would have had to pay cash, right? Today, when you go, that vendor was on the street who's selling, you would pay him using Google Pay or maybe Paytm, right? Now, this person, what is the benefit of this? 10 years back, if he went to a bank and said, "Saab, mujhe loan do. मैं 30,000 रुपए कमाता हूँ." If he says that, I earn 30,000 rupees a month, give me a loan. The bank official would say, you earning 30,000, what is the proof, right?
Firstly, he wouldn't have entered the bank only.
He may not have entered the bank itself, actually, but
that's the first step.
That's the first step, actually. And if he goes, basically, he'll be scared away.
That Jan Dhan changed all that.
Changed it. Not just that, actually, also UPI. Now he can actually, if he says, for instance, that, "अरे तुम क्या proof है तुम 30,000 रुपए कमाते हो?" He says, "साहब देखो मेरा, ये है मेरा पेटीएम में कितना मेरा आमदनी आता है एक महीना में, और मैं सप्लाइज को कितना देता हूँ, आप देख लो इसको, एक्चुअली एक से दूसरे को घटा दो, आप देख लो मैं 30,000 रुपए कमाता हूँ, आपको कितना महीने का डेटा चाहिए, आपको 6 महीने का चाहिए कि पिछले 3 साल का दूँ मैं?" And then the bank official now basically has the evidence to say, and not just that. So this basically tells you about the ability to repay for this, because if he's earning 30,000, he can possibly at least pay an EMI of maybe 3,000 up to 5,000 as well. That shows ability to repay. What about willingness to repay? When this data can be combined with data on his repayment of, basically, let's say, phone bills, maybe if he has a RuPay credit card, if he pays it on time every time.
There's a footprint everywhere.
There's a footprint, actually. You can mine that data to actually, and eventually when you want to assess credit risk, it's only about 2 things: the ability to repay and the willingness to repay. And using data, analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, this can be assessed. So this mindset is really critical. If we keep thinking that, lending has to be based only on collateral, we will not be able to avail the benefits of this huge infrastructure. This enables the opportunity for India to leapfrog. And no other country has this opportunity today. So we have to avail this opportunity. And let me use actual, data to illustrate the opportunity. If you look at credit creation in the economy, right, the world average in 2020 is for every 100 units of GDP, credit is about 180 units, around 1.8 times, 180%. In India, the same percentage in 2020 is 58%. So from 58, we can actually catch up to 180, and we already have everything that we need to. We need the mindset. We basically need to break these blinkers that credit can be given only using, only using collateral. And I think this is, if you look at the evidence across countries as well, when countries grow richer, they don't rely only on physical collateral. They use, for instance, many times, firms have what are called accounts receivable, right? They've sold a product, they've not gotten the money yet. That is what is called an accounts receivable. So that is also that's pooled. Based on that, loans are given. Like that, cash flows. There are many countries are doing this, and I think this is something that India needs to do so that credit creation can really be enabled.
So that's one of the things that you advise. Now, when you're talking about monies and payments, I have to ask you about demonetization, right? You're a defender of that.
Yes.
So tell me, do you still face brickbacks? Have you still thought that maybe you were wrong on that?
I think the point that I want to make here is that, firstly, I have never been afraid of brickbats. I think it's something that it comes with the territory. I have often thought about actually bringing a certain courage of conviction, of saying things that I think are good for the country. And I think when you look at demonetization, again, I have no hesitation in saying the kind of digital infrastructure that we've created now, that wouldn't have happened but for demonetization.
You need a hatauda hit.
You do need, and I think this is an aspect that I actually want to talk about. Reforms, or even in policy space.
I've been critical of it. So just a disclaimer on this,
fair enough,
I have criticized it across platforms.
Yes.
That the manner of doing it, I felt, was not right. Maybe in the long run, it's helped and all those things, but the manner in which it was done,
I think those are aspects that we can talk about, we can have a conversation about. But I think overall the macro, and I have no hesitation in mentioning, and let me bring evidence on this as well, right? People say it had an impact on GDP growth. And there's a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that actually went and looked at, and Quarterly Journal of Economics is a top journal actually published by Harvard University, which went and looked at the effect of demonetization on GDP growth at the country level. They didn't find anything. And they went, and therefore basically to look at this, they had to go and look at the sectoral level. At the macro level, there was no impact. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Second,
is that because of flexibility of the Indian economy? Is it because of that?
No, I think, if you look at the demonetization, it also creates...
Because Indians have gone through wars, famines, droughts. We know how to get out of it. So demonetization also, koi na koi jugaad karke nikal aaye. That kind of a thing?
Maybe that's one part of it. But also there was actually, while some parts of the economy were impacted, there were other parts of the economy that benefited significantly as well. So, that basically evens out, right? That's why, maybe some sectors, that's why this paper, they go and look at the sectoral level.
Was it needed?
I mean, as I said, actually, for instance, if I just look at, what happened during COVID, right? We wouldn't have had the kind of digital infrastructure to be able to make transfers that, kind of transfers that we did. We wouldn't have had the kind of digital infrastructure built at that point in time, right? Because, necessity is the mother of invention.
So you say that infrastructure came up because of...
Yes. I think, and there's a lot of research. I've actually put a Twitter thread on this as well, where there's a lot of academic research that shows how digital transactions have improved significantly. They've used demonetization as the experiment to go and look at the impact on the digital economy.
So it wasn't a pitfall to progress, but it was an incentive for progress?
So, this is all of this, of course, we're looking at in hindsight, right?
Yes.
I think, hindsight is 2020. You have to actually keep that in mind. But evidence clearly, shows, and there's a lot of academic research. I would refer you to maybe I'll send you that Twitter thread, maybe you can put that. So I've, using a plethora of evidence, which shows that, the digital economy wouldn't have come about. Not just that, I also wrote an article in the Times of India, showing how, tax to GDP ratios also actually, have increased improve significantly, I'd be happy to provide a reference to that article too. Using around the period of demonetisation, and I think I looked at both direct taxes and indirect taxes. So I think when I look at it from the evidential perspective, which is basically how I always like to look at every economic policy, I think it's to basically contend that it was an unadulterated let's say bad thing is something that evidence does not support for sure.
So at that time, remember, there was also this talk of MSMEs which got a body blow, and it continues because you can dispute this, that the MSMEs are the backbone of Indian economy or not, yes or no, or you can call them dwarfs, depending on how you want to look at it. Now, the government has informed the Lok Sabha, I'm told that...
No, I wouldn't call all MSMEs dwarfs.
Not all.
MSMEs that grow to become, large firms, those are actually absolutely...
Great. Okay.
And I think that's the part I also mentioned. When
those that empower rural economies, which are very important.
Yeah,
yes.
Or even the urban economy. Those who work with the urban poor, for instance,
yes.
right? Those are all, when they work with vulnerable sections or otherwise also. Any MSME that grows to become a big firm, I think, is contributing so much to the economy.
Okay, so the latest thing that one is hearing is that 49,000 MSMEs have closed down in the last 10 years, which means 3 lakh jobs gone. Now, jobs have become a big thing. You've also talked about job creation in great detail.
Yeah.
So before we go to the next segment, I just want you to tell me how should the government create more jobs? Because it's going to result in several state elections. It's going to impact politically. It's going to impact on many parents on how they want to send their kids to which stream for job creation. It's become a major issue now.
I think there's a very good question. Underlying that, there are 3-4 questions here.
Yes.
I think the first part I actually want to mention is, when it comes to employment creation and and the employment scenario, I again using data, I actually want to share that the negative narratives on this have actually run far ahead of the evidence. And a lot of the negative narratives have typically come using the CMI data, which I actually I don't find it reliable. Even when I was with the government, when good news came on employment of CMI, I wouldn't use that because I was not sure.
Our good friend Shamika Ravi has the same thing to say. Yes.
And I would actually then, is it news or is it noise? Actually, that's something which is very hard to... if you look at, high quality data, PLFS data, for instance, and, this is, you take the ILO report on the Indian employment scenario, go and search CMI, actually go a text search, go basically read, you won't find a single mention of CMI. But ILO uses the PLFS data because it is high quality. Using PLFS and using, for instance, the CLEMS database. CLEMS database is also a high quality database. From the vantage point I occupy at the IMF, it is basically available not just for India but across countries, and this is something that actually is seen to be high quality across. RBI, which is an independent institution, used the CLEMS database to assess the employment creation over the last 10 years. And what do they find? They find that overall 12.5 crore jobs have been created over the last 10 years, of which 3.5 crores are in agriculture. Set that aside, agriculture. So just non-agriculture jobs, 9 crore jobs have been created. That means on average 90 lakh jobs have been created over the last 10 years, on average in a year. So this is something that doesn't suggest that basically employment has not been created. As I said, this is one area where, again, like we spoke about in the context of agriculture, there are those that actually, maybe benefit from pushing this narrative that employment has not been created. Now, that said, I'm not saying that employment is not something that should not be focused upon. Just because we've done, good work on that doesn't mean we have to focus on it. Even if, let's say, I've gotten 70 marks out of 100, I would still work hard to get 90, 95. And that's why the focus on employment creation in this year's budget, I think, is something that's a very welcome. I like that in particular. And here, I think, as we were speaking earlier as well, when we think about the 4-pillar strategy for social and economic inclusion, jobs are really the most critical. We were talking about, if I remember, my dad earlier, right? If for instance, if he did not have a job in the formal sector, there's no way he would have been able to educate me and my, and my younger brother. And as a result of him educating, not just, we got uplifted, actually my kids and then their generation, think about, so many generations actually benefit. That is what is the power of a job in the formal sector. Even one that actually is not so well paying. He was, as I said, he was actually in the clerical grades but that is the power. If that job was not there, he might have actually maybe been in the informal sector, and maybe in that case, I wouldn't have been able to be educated the way, so that shows the importance
the informed choices that he would make and then subsequently you would make as a result of that.
So I think, jobs, I think, are a national priority because we have a young population. And, when I go back and look, I'm sure it must be the case with you as well. Possibly one of the best days we remember is when we got our first job, because it is actually so uplifting to a person's own identity. And not only does it actually have an economic impact, as I just mentioned, but it has an impact on actually a person's self-worth. And therefore, jobs are really critical. And I think that is an area where you have to continue working. Skilling is really important here. Making sure that skilling is demand-based, I think, which is an effort is now being made using the policies that have been announced. Especially, I like the internship idea, and I think
you mentioned that in your book also, that the jobs have to be, skilling and jobs have to go hand in hand.
Correct. And here I think it's important also to focus on the ITIs. We focus on IITs a lot. But I think ITIs also actually are a really critical, because they are the ones that provide the skills to go and work in the manufacturing sector.
But you remember when you got admission into IIT, if you had ever said that I want to do ITI, the stigma that was associated then?
I think, and that's I'm really glad you brought that up. I think, I don't want to sound, sort of in a way that comes out negative, but think about it, right? I mean, as I said, I was privileged that my father provided me the education, and I think for me, getting into IIT was the jump function in my life. I still regard that as. At the same time, those, let's say, who are working in an informal sector job, maybe they're actually they're selling dab, let's say coconut water on a thela, for instance, or they're selling, let's say, these in Sarojini Nagar, they're selling, let's say, belts or wallets, etc. If they work in the formal sector, they actually will not face as much uncertainty in the revenue. They have a manufacturing sector job. They would, earn well, and the uncertainty gets reduced, because if these people, for instance, they may earn, let's say, 30,000 rupees this month, maybe this next month they may only earn 20,000, right? And that uncertainty also has an impact on consumption, right? Aggregate consumption actually gets, if you think about it at an individual household level as well, we go and actually buy a new car, or let's say a better house only when we get a promotion, because we know that our income is actually reduced, uncertainty has reduced, and we're actually going to get higher income. That operates for every household. So I think jobs are important at the micro level of every individual for his or her self-worth, for his economic or his or her economic welfare, but at the same time also at the macroeconomic level, because jobs will create a middle class, that'll spur consumption and thereby economic growth as well. I think this is something that is really critical, and here I want to take the opportunity to focus on state governments. We've talked a lot about central government, I think the policies that need to be implemented, but we are a federal structure, and in a federal structure, state governments have as much, when it comes to things like manufacturing, which is really critical for job creation. If you take what are the most important inputs in manufacturing, it is basically land, labor, capital, power, logistics or transportation, and scale, right? Of which, except for capital, everything, all the other five are basically state levels, right?
Correct.
So, it is important, therefore, for states to focus on this. And we as citizens now need to start asking, our state government, saying, have you done reform on this? Have you reformed your land laws so that, companies can come and set up shop here, set up factories so that, our youth can get jobs? What are don't just tell us basically you've created reservation here and reservation there, because reservation is just about, it's like cutting the slice slice of the pizza in different ways, right? Maybe one large slice here, but I ask the question: are you creating are you moving from a small size pizza to a large size pizza?
Yeah.
That is what job creation really is. So we need to start asking those questions. I am not getting sort of swayed by just your reservation. I want to be basically, what is your plan from the small size pizza you have now for me to the large size pizza? How many years will you increase the size of the pizza through more jobs? What are you doing on land? What are you doing on labor? What are you doing on power? When are you going to stop basically the bleeding of the discoms? When are you going to stop giving subsidized free power to farmers, because that is what makes power for manufacturing firms much costlier, and that is why firms don't, their costs go up. What are you doing on transportation? I think this is something, this is, if you take for instance, city travel, right? Google data now, actually Google Maps data can highlight, I want to give some anecdotal examples.
Bangalore is the worst.
Bangalore is the worst, actually, and other states.
Where we have the Silicon Valley of India, that's the worst.
Yes.
Yeah. How are you going to increase manufacturing if that's what you're going to be doing?
Exactly, and because it affects quality of life. For instance, just to, I came from Noida now, Noida to R.K. Puram. It's about a 22 kilometer, and it took me 35 minutes at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So it wasn't peak. I think if I had set out at, let's say, 6 p.m., I might have come here in maybe an hour and a half, right? For an hour and a half for a 22 kilometer distance. 22 kilometers is about 15 miles, right?
Yeah.
In advanced economies, actually, this will be traveled in maybe 20 minutes. Yeah. Think about the impact on quality of life. Whose responsibility is this? It is the state government's.
Yeah.
It is because the NHAI, actually, that's the central government.
Yeah.
But, city traffic is the state government.
Yeah.
And when we travel through, there are so many potholes. Every time rainy season, there is a pothole that comes up. Why can't we build, actually, why can't we build roads that don't have potholes? Why can't we, those construction, people who actually, if they're building a road and if the pothole comes up, why can't we actually penalize them? This is all, it's about carrot and stick, right?
Yeah.
I think these are
when it comes to electing governments and elections come in, these issues are never brought up. It's only freebies and how those freebies. In fact, one of the questions which I wanted to ask you was about freebies. Before, I think my producer's going on wondering when I'm going to go to that section. But freebies, please, let's go to that because we are already in election season.
Yes.
We're going to go into Maharashtra. We're going to go into the next election too.
Yeah.
We've seen how it's impacted in Karnataka and in Himachal recently. Tell me how it's going to be something which is going to...
No, I'll definitely, but let me just complete this thought, right? Which actually, I think, on quality of life, and I think if we have to, instead of having brain drain, if you have to have brain gain, I think quality of life is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is where I think state governments, we need to start asking the questions. These will become part of the, election, manifestos.
Did you go back to DC because of that?
No, of course not.
Not because of quality of life.
Actually, I think.
Sorry, I've diverged.
I think that's a good question. I actually went because the responsibility was entrusted. I chose, Smita ji, I came back actually in 2009 to live here in India. As soon as this tenure is over, I'll be back at ISB. I'll be actually. I love being in India. That's it has nothing to do with. Remember, I mentioned actually, if at all I think about it as well, there'll be my father's voice, asking me to. So
no, because quality of life is something experts always talk about. They always say that had it not been for that, they would have not been, and they would come back to India any day.
Correct.
Reverse brain drain, whatever you want to call it, they would come back any day.
Yes. And this responsibility is with the states. We need to start asking questions. And a specific thing that I want to mention here is, during the union budget, there's a lot of activity, a lot of attention put on that. But I think equal attention now needs to be placed on state budgets as well. The CIIs of the world, the FICCIs of the world, the ASSOCHAMs actually need to have, when let's say the, Andhra Pradesh budget is presented, or Tamil Nadu or Gujarat or Maharashtra, they need to have a debate similarly basically about, and other states too, there are chapters actually in every state of these, and the media also needs to start asking questions. Now there should be edits written about actually why did the Tamil Nadu budget not reform land laws, for instance, why didn't the Gujarat, why didn't they basically work on labor, for instance, why didn't Maharashtra not do it? It's time that we actually start holding our states responsible, because power and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. I think this is something that needs to happen, and we citizens need to actually ask these questions of the chief ministers. And I think
absolutely,
and media attention together with industry bodies actually enabling this attention is absolutely sine qua non now for the emphasis on policy at the state level to really start happening.
Very good. Absolutely should do. Freebies next.
Yeah. So I think when we think about freebies versus welfare, right? And in a country like India, I think it is absolutely critical that we have to do welfare spending because we still have a large population that is still vulnerable. And the way I distinguish about it, it's actually the difference is between doling out loaves of fish versus teaching someone to fish. To fish. Welfare spending, I actually categorize as that builds capabilities, which is to teach someone to fish. Freebies is basically just doling out loaves of fish. If we, for instance, take, let's say, let me take specific examples. Take, for instance, the amount of, Ayushman Bharat, right? And Shamika Ravi has tweeted on this. I put a nice Twitter thread as well, showing how it has reduced the amount of out-of-pocket spending. Remember, actually, I know I'm always reminded of this scene from Three Idiots, right? The movie Three Idiots, where Raju's mother is talking about how much she spends actually, and how almost bulk of her salary goes in taking care of the the ailing father. That basically had been the situation of most poor households actually in India. Today, for the first time now, the spend by the government has risen above that by out-of-pocket spending. That has happened because of basically Ayushman Bharat, right? So that is actually that is welfare. It is basically built that capability, built that safety net for. Similarly, if you take LPG connections, LPG connection. Women who used to basically go and khatte the using coal and I remember my mom actually. I've helped basically we've cooked on coal, we've cooked on kerosene stoves, charcoal, we've cooked on all of that, right? And now almost every household uses LPG, and that is a much cleaner fuel,
or
which
pipe
actually
gas,
and I think as a result of that our grihinis have been able to also takes time out actually. And if you look at some of the the change in the labor market also actually is happening because they have more time now. They can pay attention to their kids. They actually
and health. TB, it's come down because charcoal fumes.
Correct, exactly. And so these are all essentially building capabilities. This is good welfare spending. Similarly, if you take Swachh Bharat as well, it has actually, and one of the, I think Ayurveda teaches us basically that prevention is actually much better than cure, right? And as part of that, when we avoid, when we have better sanitation, we had shown this in the economics of 2018-19 as well, using the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, those that had 100% sanitation versus those that did not, have districts that shown that malaria deaths, cholera deaths, etc., those that are waterborne diseases, and children that are stillborn, infant mortality below 5, all those declined. And now there's an article in Nature as well which has actually shown the same thing in a much more rigorous manner. So I think this is also another evidence of actually building capabilities.
No, like today, our newspaper today has a report about excessive fecal matter in river Yamuna. Nobody is going to hold the government, the state government, to task. This is there in our major newspaper, that the only river that where we get water in Delhi, River Yamuna, has excessive fecal matter in it. Can you imagine? And now the whole health thing that's going to come.
I think I think this is one area where I would urge, because you're so passionate about progress. So it's really important. I think you should do for the benefit of our audience, what are the responsibilities of states and what is that of the center? Because we end up actually we are a federal structure, and in a federal structure, I think making sure that states are held accountable is, I think, really important. And we citizens have, in a democracy, citizens have to actually play that role. And the media has the role of basically making citizens aware of what is a state government's responsibility versus a central government's responsibility.
Probably take the podcast to all the states one by one and then cover it.
Absolutely.
And very, very good suggestion.
I think maybe after a state government presents its budget, maybe get the state's chief minister to actually explain to you what has he done to improve ease of living, what has he done to improve ease of doing business, what has he done to actually make sure road traffic is reduced. And I think here Google Maps data can be used. Actually, we can use people can put up now. I hope people can start tweeting saying it takes this much time to cover 10 kilometers in Delhi, Bangalore, Mumbai, etc., and this much time in Copenhagen or Washington DC or New York. Compare and say, Chief Minister, what is your plan for reducing this? In the next year, 2 years.
I had Piyush Goyal on the show, and I remember him telling me at one point of time, maybe this was before I began the podcast, maybe an interview, when he was saying that when they talked about electrification, and when they sat for one of the meetings with the Prime Minister and said that we've electrified so many villages. He said, "Na, मेरे को नहीं चाहिए, मेरे को अपने phone पे चाहिए. Show me."
Yes.
So put it on the map, and I need to go into that click on it to see whether that village has been electrified or not.
Yes.
And he gave them a time span
Yeah.
that within that.
Correct.
So PG showed me on his phone and he said, name any village in the country.
Yes.
And we click.
Yeah.
If there is no light,
Yes.
that means I have not electrified it.
Correct.
I cannot go to the Prime Minister and say that, so many villages I have electrified.
Yes, yes. In fact, actually, after I had finished as a chief economic advisor, I happened to visit Gujarat, and there I saw there is this, it's basically called the chief ministers. I think it's the chief ministers like war room, or I think that's what, where they have actually, they can dial any person to know whether, if they've got the benefits, whatever programs, they can randomly, and that, why don't other states also build this, make sure that, so to ensure that the last mile has gotten the benefits, the last person actually, I think these are aspects, again, we need to be holding responsible.
On healthcare, immunization.
Or healthcare, actually.
On all these
correct,
things.
Correct.
That
and I think I want to actually point out the examples of, our current, Prime Minister itself, as a chief minister, he won so many times. Or Modi ji or Shivraj Chauhan ji as well, right?
Unless they
so
don't
I think
do it.
They basically. So what is it that our chief ministers can learn from? Do good work and make sure you communicate it as well. In a democracy, communication is really critical. So, but I think so. In fact, I actually had written an article about after the state elections that happened in December as well, when all this hullabaloo about north-south divide, etc. was talked about. It was basically the fact that people kept always talking about anti-incumbency, etc. But I think many of these state governments have shown that if you actually do good work, you can come back to power. I think, and that is the lesson to actually learn, that if you don't do good work, then you'll actually be, our voters are very, very smart. They'll actually, they'll basically look for a substitute for that.
So voting becomes an emotive issue also, because in many cases, for example, the Jammu Kashmir election, in Kashmir you would have provided everything, but when it comes to voting, it doesn't happen. Whereas with Shivraj Chauhan, with Modi, I remember interviewing them, and they said that we have to bring pani into the village, and unless, if I keep saying ki pani aayega, they are not going to vote.
Yes.
Till the water doesn't come into the village,
yes.
and because with water comes prosperity.
Yes.
Unless water, and for decades water hasn't come to that village.
Yes.
So unless you don't bring the water,
yes.
I can keep talking about how computer aane wala hai. Nahi.
I think
pani aayega to aayega.
Correct. I think what you're saying is absolutely right, that elections, of course, are also, there are emotive aspects. I'm not, the elections are, they're multi-dimensional phenomena.
Correct,
okay.
Yes.
But all I'm saying is everything else held constant. Good economic work, actually delivery that people can see, can have an impact, and I think evidence from some of these state governments actually. So on the freebies, I think that, as I said, that is delivering loaves of fish. And there are many examples. For instance, if you take, let's say the in Karnataka, for instance, that is being given free bus, right? Is it building any capacity? Is it actually teaching people to fish? I don't think so. That's a freebie. Or for that matter, returning back to the old pension scheme, in Himachal Pradesh, for instance. Is it something that is building capability? I'm not quite sure either. And this is anyways, this is something I've always believed. In our country, those that have salaried class are better off than those that are basically far more poor, far vulnerable. And I think, welfare spending needs to be focused on those that are far more vulnerable, right? Because that's where we need to lift, so I think these are examples of freebies clearly, which I don't think build capabilities, and even from an economic point of view. And this is something that which shown in the economic survey as well. If you take if the fisc is invests 100 rupees, let's say, if that 100 rupees is spent on revenue spending, which is freebies, salaries, etc., then the economy accumulates only 93 rupees. In other words, 6 to 7 rupees gets lost. In contrast, if that 100 rupees is spent on asset creation, capability creation, then the economy accumulates anywhere between 400 to 600 rupees. Now, think about it. Actually, if I am, let's say, doing my own investment, would I ever go and invest somewhere where I invest 100 rupees and get 93? Or would I go and invest where I put 100 rupees and get 400 to 600 after a few years? I think that's common sense. It's obvious, right?
Yeah.
So is again something that people need to be thinking about. When it comes to building capabilities, that is what is, if you want to actually not just you to be economically made capable, but your kids as well and subsequent generations, it is welfare spending and building capabilities that will deliver that, not freebies.
Okay. On that note, let's go to the final segment, snap reaction. Okay. So, on Arun Jaitley. Have you met him ever?
Yes, I did. Actually,
You did.
he was my first boss when I joined as the chief economic advisor in December of 2018.
He wasn't.
December 2008.
Yeah.
He was there. Actually.
Yeah, he was there. Yes.
Because the elections happened in May 2019. Right? So,
okay. So tell
in fact,
me.
he was the one who actually, after I was appointed, he called me to congratulate me as well. So
Okay. What are your takeaways about him as finance minister? What are your?
I think he had friends across the spectrum. That's
Okay.
one thing that I noticed, he had the ability to actually convey things in a way that
Because
was
communication is an important part, as you
communication is
mentioned in
extremely
your.
critical, actually.
I mean, we've talked about it. You've
yes,
written about
yeah,
it. For a finance minister to be able to speak across the political spectrum,
Yes.
as well as to
Yes.
though he was from Rajya Sabha, but to speak to the people.
Correct. And I think, in fact, I remember this one instance where, he was a big cricket fan as well, and I'm a big cricket fan too. So I think there was a parliament question for which actually, so I went to his parliament room, and if I remember right, Chiteshwar Pujara and I think and maybe Rishabh Pant were batting.
Okay.
So we're talking about it actually, and I was talking about Chiteshwar Pujara and Rishabh Pant, and I feel like, so I'm engaged in that cricket conversation, and all of a sudden he basically asks the question on what I've written. So I was actually I was struck by that while having
Seamlessly he can make the
Yes, actually,
transition.
and while having that conversation on cricket, he's also reading that stuff and asks a question. So I think that's something which, I mean, I can acknowledge. I would, if I'm talking cricket, I'm only talking cricket.
Next, what do we have? Dr. Manmohan Singh. So, your
Very
reaction?
studious, and I think as an economist, I think I would like to think that somebody of his talent and his brilliance could have delivered more for the country.
Okay. All right. Next one. Nirmala Sitharaman.
I think, the thing that strikes me most about ma'am is actually she's very honest, and oftentimes to a fault. And I think one aspect that most people don't know that much about is she has a very good sense of humor, which I think in private meetings it comes about. Even her way of praising essentially is in a very, very, very different way, and it shows a sense of humor. I think I've had that privilege to be able to see some of that, and I think
A very Tambram type of kind of.
No, I wouldn't. No, I don't think Tambrams have good sense of humor.
No.
I don't think so.
No, what I mean to say is praising somebody, they don't do that.
No, she actually,
They do it in that backhanded
She's liberal
manner.
with praise. She's liberal with praise.
Okay.
But she does it in a very unique way.
Okay.
In a way. No,
Do you think she gets a lot of criticism being a woman in that job?
Absolutely. I think, I mean, you've nailed it, right? Which is, I remember mentioning this, when Hillary Clinton, lost to Donald Trump, students asked me at that time to actually basically give, my view. And for instance, Hillary Clinton, if she's being strict, let's say, or if she's, demanding, people basically will not use very good, the man,
Yeah.
Bill Clinton, they'd say, oh, he's basically assertive. But the same word assertive is not used for Hillary. I think in a similar way, if she's basically, let's say, easygoing, again, people will say for Bill Clinton, they say charming, but the same word would not be used for. I think these are biases, and I think that's something which I absolutely recognize that, with ma'am. And I think, a lot of credit for her. Before this, she was a defense minister.
What do you have to say? He's been a very, very vocal critic of Nirmala Sitharaman. How do you see him as when he was finance minister and currently as critic in chief?
I find him oftentimes clever by the half.
He's critical of your a lot. I have an entire list, but then won't go into this right now.
Well, I'm sure there is a political element to it too. And that's the part. That's why I say the clever by the half. I think he's a smart person, definitely. But again, his smartness actually, and I think, for instance, the tax
He brought
reduction
that, remember that voluntary disclosure
exactly.
scheme and
And
things.
I think the tax reduction at source, I think, was also his idea, if I remember right. So I think some good ideas he's implemented, and I think he also is another person who actually could have done more. But I think in general, I actually when ability is put only to the benefit of the country, without any I, me, myself, involved in it, I think that is what leads to the best outcomes for the nation. And I think that's an aspect that one can learn from by observing, and maybe learning from what could have been done.
His battles with Pranab Mukherjee, was he a better home minister as compared to a finance minister, you feel?
Hard to say.
Hard to say. Okay. Next. Yeah, okay. So, what do you recall? If people were to recall him as finance minister, it's the Vodafone deal.
Yes, and I think I don't think he was a good finance minister.
Yeah, irreparable damage to the Indian economy.
And not just that, actually. In fact, I remember this speech of his where he said, after the global financial crisis, he said, the fact that we basically did not go the route of the US bank nationalization, etc., is what enabled India to avoid the global financial crisis. That is not quite correct at all. It is basically securitization and governance actually failures that led to. So I think it's I don't think his policies were ones that really helped India, that much.
Raghuram Rajan.
My advisor,
yes.
My mentor. I actually, think about him as somebody who's, contributed significantly to as my advisor. And then when he came as the RBI governor as well, I got the opportunity to be on the PGNI committee. So somebody who, whom I've enjoyed the mentorship of, and I like thinking about it, actually. I remember when I joined as a chief economic advisor, I think one of the media houses had actually done and asked me this question. I basically gave this example from Mahabharata. Arjuna and Dronacharya, were on two different sides in terms of, and on policy aspects we've differed as well. But Arjuna never, stopped respecting Dronacharya, because, eventually Arjuna became Arjuna because of Dronacharya. So that debt of gratitude is something I'll always have.
Is he bullish on India?
Well, I think that is something that he would be better able to answer.
Okay. Do you feel let down when he's not bullish on India? Do you feel?
No, I don't think a student has a right to be let down, by a teacher. A teacher can say, I think a student has let him, or, I don't think that privilege. For instance, you wouldn't tell, your parent that, you let me down. I don't think you would say that.
Modern day.
No, I think that is basically.
But yes, this is your Guru Shishya Parampara, I guess.
I would not actually. That is not something that is, I think, right for me.
Okay, I appreciate that. Sanjeev Sanyal. You worked with him?
Yes, actually, good human being, good friend.
Now he's, I think, accepted the Gokhale University.
Yes, he has. And I think he has he some of the stuff that he's advocated, actually, he needs to go and implement that.
Yes. And very much on the lines of Vivek Debroy. I think very Ram Lakshman relationship they have.
No, I think, he was a valuable ally as well when I was when I was in the government.
Okay. Arvind Subramanian.
Two different Subramanians, actually, but two very different individuals.
Really? Okay. In what way, if I may ask?
Well, I think for instance, I did not like the way, he raised suspicions about India's GDP growth in work that was actually of very questionable quality. I think I'd written about it in the in the economic survey as well. I've been a firm believer that when one occupies August office, after one finishes that August office, whether you like it or not, people take you seriously. You are an economic ambassador for the nation, and I think irrespective of one's political preferences, I think the nation always must come first. And you can test me out, if and when, let's say, there might be. I would rather choose to be silent than unnecessarily criticize. And I think in this case there was absolutely no even there was no evidence, and I showed that very clearly, that the GDP growth, being overestimated by 2.5%, that was not right. So I think for that because that created a lot of suspicion about the quality of statistics, etc., which India could have done without, definitely. And I think that's damage from the country that actually appointed you as the chief economic advisor, and that is why whether it's me, whether it's him or anybody else, we get this basically the public figure, etc., status only because of having occupied that august office. Having done that, to then basically go and I think that's something which for me, I don't hold it in very high regard.
Okay. Amartya Sen, similar?
Nobel laureate.
He's not bullish on India these days.
There was a saying that when elephants tread, bees and ants actually try to stay away. So on some of these big figures, I think I'm not very enamored by their I think talking about India in a very negative way. I think there's a lot of work that has been done. I think there's evidence as well.
That the sad part is, when you realize that your heroes have feet of clay, it's crushing.
I think some innocence gets robbed.
Yeah.
I think the innocence actually.
Itna na padti to theek hota, I feel sometimes.
Yeah.
Right?
I think I have gone through that myself. Some of the innocence getting robbed. I think. In general, and I think this is an aspect that it's important to understand and to give credit where it is due. To think that because of ideological reasons that we will basically always criticize this government, I think that ends up hurting the country as well, and I think that's the part that I don't agree with as much.
So I must tell you, Professor, when I picked up the book, I always read who it's credited to, who you're writing for. And I'm going to read out this part, which was so touching. I'm a dad's daughter too, so for me this was
I'm a dad's son.
You're a dad's son.
Yeah.
So,
and my mom's son too, of course, but my dad was my biggest fan. So
I have to read this out and I want to talk to you about it.
Please.
So I'm going to read this out for those who haven't yet bought the book. It says, "My Appa dear, your love is always crystal clear. You paved my way, though my life was askew, for you were denied education by poverty's brew. Through your hardships deep, you forged my fate. You ensured my comfort despite your young shoulders bearing elders' weight." Now, this is elders' weight. This is something I'm interrupting. This is something that only Indians who've grown up in joint families or Indians Indian men who have the responsibility of educating their brothers and sisters, getting them married, they understand this aspect. You showed a father's love, one that you never knew, for you lost your own appa when you were just a few. In your heart burnt a patriot's flame, burnt bright, never tame. For the nation's pride, I saw you toiling away in your difficult roles in Indian Railways day by day. Appa from up in the stars, I know you see, satisfied that your hard work's fruits luckily bloomed in me. With pride and love, I hope you witness how your legacy lives on, in every step, in every dawn. So stay peaceful and happy, my dear Appa, in celestial space, as I hold close your sacrifices, your grace. For your labor, your strife, gifted me this blessed life. I found it so touching, and he obviously played a very important role in your life, right?
Indeed, very much. Actually, in fact, I'm living a lot of his dream as well. And so, I think he see, there are so many aspects. I can do a podcast on him only. So
yeah, he was that.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that he was in. One gets to know that he was in the railway. So obviously you moved around in the country, and money was hard to come by.
Yeah, he actually, he didn't have the because as I've mentioned as well, he lost his father when he was just 7 years old, and he was able to complete, schooling because of the largesse of his elder brother and an elder sister. And he could only complete school, and he joined the Indian Railways, so gave the Railway Service Commission examination and joined the Indian Railways, while waiting for those results in the class 4 capacity. And then for large parts, actually, he was in the non-gazetted grade, retired as an assistant accounts officer, all through, his own hard work, clearing departmental examinations. And so, I think he gave me and my younger brother, we are 2 siblings, he gave us the gift of education. I was the first person to attend university in my entire clan, and that couldn't have happened but for him. So, I've done a TED talk as well on when all his elder siblings actually had chosen to send their kids to vernacular medium. My parents said, no, we will send them to English medium. Because they basically felt that was important at that point.
That's the passport to.
Yeah, at that point in time, he had to pay fees. My fees at that time was 15 rupees a month.
Where was this?
This was in Bilaspur. That's where I was born. In what is part of Chhattisgarh now. It was part of Madhya Pradesh. 15 rupees was, I think, about a quarter of his salary.
My goodness.
And I don't know whether actually, if I had to pay a quarter of my salary, whatever it is, for one kid's education, whether I would have mustered that courage. And I think, but he remembered very well, and he said actually that money will come later, I will earn later, but the kid's opportunity to study will actually not come back later. I think those are so profound words actually said.
And many of us think that our children don't know about the hardships, and our parents try to hide this from us when we are children.
So
but
true.
It's not as if my childhood was there was any want, but I'm well aware that there were months when it was very hard, when 2 months fees had to be given by the parents because of whatever the summer vacation or something happened. And at the same time, rent had to be paid, and there was a wedding in the family, or there was school fees or college fees of some relative which had to be paid. And there was no money left.
No, actually, I think there are, I can talk, as I said, I can do a full podcast on him, and wherever he is, I hope he sees how grateful I am for what he's done.
Did he know about it when you got appointed as Chief Economic Advisor to Prime Minister
Well,
Modi?
actually, no, he wasn't there. He passed away in 2015, and I was appointed as a Chief Economic Advisor in 2018. But he was there. Before I talk about that, I just want to mention a couple of, important episodes, right? You talked about, I remember when I was, I think in primary school, he used to have just one pant and one shirt because he was supporting, 2 of his widowed sisters as well on his salary. They had, and so that's why money was hard to come by. He used to have one pant and one shirt, and many times during the rainy times, it would be, my mom would actually wash it and put it up, and it wouldn't dry. So in the morning, I would sit and iron it so that he could wear it too. I remember those, and a similar way, but later what I do remember is that when I was, for instance, I was part of the PJNI committee, this was in 2013, and he used to live in Mumbai at that time. I'd bought a flat before I went for my PhD. So he'd wait for me to come back, and, he would want a debriefing on everything that was discussed, every aspect. What did you say? How did the others react? So he was a voracious reader, that's a voracious reader, actually,
Really?
All self-learned. And, there's so many books. Even now, today I pick up books, for instance, especially I pick up the Yoga Vashishta, there there'll be his signature and at the date when he finished that passage. So I read that, and actually, and so he would read a lot, on the days when so he would ask me basically what was the discussion and who said what, and I'd love giving him that it's like, imagine actually you had the biggest fan actually, right? So
but did you say, no dad, I don't want to do, I'm embarrassed?
Never.
Many people do that, right?
No, actually, I somehow, I guess I've realized how privileged it was that he used to enjoy it. The first time I was actually on TV, this was in 2012, I was on NDTV. This started at 8 o'clock. My mom told me after that, from 8 o'clock till 5, he sat actually glued to the television. My mom had to bring food for him. And so it's, these are memories that are so special for me. I would have loved to have him around actually to share all the conversations, some of that, I think. And Yeah, it's just, but I do remember, I do know, wherever he is, I'm sure actually he sees it.
Yeah.
He had that belief, and in fact, he was the one who was very insistent that I should remain in India.
Okay.
When, for instance, I was at Indian School of Business, I'd spent about a decade in the US, come back, and I was getting offers from other places to move.
Huh.
Some places in around Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. My mom would say, she would say, wherever you are, just be happy. That was my mom's. My dad's message was, no, you have to serve the nation, whatever it is, in your small way, serve the nation. And that
How
is something.
wonderful.
So it's he was very, very, very clear. And and therefore I have to not think once, twice, I have to think 10 times before, if actually if I have to choose anything outside of the nation. He just felt, actually, just do your part. Even if you're paying taxes, that is actually itself a service. Why do you want to pay taxes to the US government or to the Singapore government? That's how. So yeah, I think a lot of, I'm sure, Smitaji, as you mentioned, actually, these are values that, many of us middle class families, lower middle class families, actually,
we don't realize
imbibed.
how our parents' teachings, or the time spent with our parents, how it is making us take decisions
Yes.
long after they've gone.
Absolutely. No, in fact, I think that this is one part I look back with a lot of fondness. Before he passed away, I was there actually with him, about a week when he was in hospital. On one occasion, I remember, he knew his time had come. He actually had sort of, so he said, he was just assessing, and he was saying, what did I do in my life, and things like that. And then on one occasion, I mentioned to him that, whenever I will actually hug any of my two kids, you will be there at that time, because you were the one who taught me how to be, a wonderful father. So everything that I would be doing as a father would be basically what I have learned from you. And so, both of us had tears in our eyes, and, I think it was a beautiful moment.
So do you, at times, like when you are in doubt, do you think about what the conversations you've had with your dad? Is that
many times?
Yeah?
I think, for instance, some of the things that he would say, right? I remember, I think all of us have gone through phases of self-doubt. I think this is an especially message that I want to convey to youngsters, because when they look at people who, let's say, done some things in life, they may think that, they were all very, very, supremely confident. Yes, confidence is there, but I think there's also periods of self-doubt. And I remember a particular period when, for instance, during when the COVID was happening, and I used to actually think about. I mean, honestly, I used to think that, would I be remembered as the worst chief economic advisor the country had?
Oh my God, yes.
And at that time, actually, some of the things he would say basically, do your part, what is in your control, do it, and then leave the outcome basically to to the divine. He was particular believer in the Bhagavad Gita. Every shloka of the Bhagavad Gita, he had read it actually, and so and he would especially talk about the karmanya vadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana ma karma phale heturubhu mate sangosto karmani, that shloka. And so I was reminded of that, and I would think that, that's basically what I have to do. What is in my control, I will do. And so many times I would wake up at 3:30 in the night actually, and remind him, what he told me, go and read, and that was in my control. Think about basically the problem, what it was, and but the outcome is not in my hands. And I think at those times actually, I think a lot of what he taught really, in fact, many times when I've actually faced self-doubt, I think his own, because many people doubted him, many of his colleagues, many of his siblings also doubted him, but just by the sheer dint of hard work, whatever he achieved. And I think that to me has been an incredible inspiration. So
you speak about the pandemic even in the book, where you talk about this once in a millennium thing that happens, and for India to come out of that. And you were chief economic advisor at one of the most crucial junctures in the country. Were you at that time? Did you have self-doubt? Did you at times say that, I just want to leave? Did you want to leave midway? Did you want to quit midway? Was it too much of a stress?
No. So here's where I think this is what this credo that my appa taught me, I think has held me in good stead, which is, there are periods when I actually do, maybe for a few minutes, I would feel sort of nervous. I wouldn't say stressed, but nervous, and I would get up but then I would say, let me focus on what is in my hand, focus on reading, focus on controlling things, actually try and give the best, what I can do best, actually give the best advice possible. And I think that is all that is, so I don't get, I'm quite passionate, but I don't get that stressed, visibly stressed at least.
Because you're young, you know what I mean? Like suppose now Bibek Debroy, right? with all that he's read about Mahabharata, written about Mahabharata, about spiritualism, I can imagine him more thera hua. You're young, you're energetic, and to have this huge catastrophe of a pandemic, and then everything rests on how you advise the Prime Minister of the day on how to extricate the country out of this horrible situation that we are in.
No, I think firstly, Smita, I think I would really mention that a lot of credit, lion's share of the credit has to go to the Honorable Prime Minister, because I've genuinely believed that advice is only necessary. It is leadership that makes it sufficient. It's possible because the advice can always be ignored as well, right? So in that sense, the lion's share of credit has to go to the Honorable Prime Minister, who displayed enormous, willpower actually to be able to do things that were not conventional. When you had other countries, advanced economies actually doing things that were quite different, to build our own vaccine, and then go do the vaccination, do a lockdown that was necessary at that point in time with the kind of health infrastructure we had, and then also to do the economic policy, implement be a lot more frugal in spending, invest in infrastructure. All those, I think these are aspects that actually were unconventional, and I think eventually, look, we have to grant it that because if things had gone wrong, nobody would have blamed me. He would have been blamed, and so in that sense, for him to have that courage of conviction to actually implement these, I think a lion's share of credit has to go to him.
Did you back that the lockdown that happened? Wasn't it too brutal to the economy as well as to the people?
So you see, the thing is, I think these are aspects where I've looked at the data. If you look at, for instance, the per capita deaths that happened, right? If you take the United States or Germany, any of these countries, their deaths were 10 times that, at least 10 times that of India. And you have to remember, that during the first wave, even doctors were figuring out at that time, whether they want to put people on ventilator or not. They were going up the learning curve with our health infrastructure. And I must remind, because I actually remember reading this, there were basically assessments done by Princeton University, John Hopkins, etc., which were talking about India's peak happening around end May of 2020. And if at that time and they were talking about millions of lives being lost. And that was and I think if we basically did not have that lockdown enabled us to actually catch up, with the health infrastructure that we had. And I've actually written about this, in the economic survey as well. I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that with the health infrastructure that we had, I think we could have the situation could have been far, far worse if the lockdown had not happened. I think by doing the lockdown, we were able to delay the peak of the first wave to end September. And that is, I think, something that gave us a lot of breathing space to basically have masks become ready, for instance. From having absolutely no masks to become the largest producer of masks, from being basically the kind of PPE kits and the kind of health infrastructure we
didn't even have paracetamol to deal with.
Absolutely. I mean, you would remember, that for instance, countries like Spain, Italy, etc., there were people actually outside the hospitals. They were on, they didn't have enough space.
Italy.
Italy. I remember, even Spain. I remember as well. That was if the advanced economies were facing such kind of, imagine for a country, or for that matter, I'll just give you a simple. Take for instance Mumbai. Take the Mumbai local, right? You're going from, let's say, Virar to Churchgate. It's about an hour's journey, right? People are packed. There's one person, let's say, who's infected. In that 1 hour journey, the entire compartment would be infected. And just keep in mind, actually, while we are a young population, just our elderly population was about 300, close to 300 million. Now imagine this person, basically 1,000 people, let's say,
one America.
Yes, exactly. One compartment, people being in that, going, and then they basically going to their parents and infecting them. Just think about 350 million if they had gotten, and the kind of with that. So I have no hesitation, and I actually said this with data as well, with evidence that given our health infrastructure, given what we were facing at that time, the first wave. And I think another way of looking at it is basically, the kind of difficulties we had to face during the second wave, when we had we had the UPP kits, we had the the masks, etc. Yet it was actually, the Omicron variant actually did create
because
a lot
we
of
hadn't vaccinated everybody by the second wave.
by that time. But I think that, so if in the first wave there was no possibility of a vaccine,
the alpha
right?
had no.
So no possibility. And think about, that's a counterfactual to keep in mind, that with the health infrastructure, with doctors still not having learnt basically what is the right way to treat it. For instance, they were putting people on ventilators during in the first wave, and that was something that was discontinued, right? With that, with our health infrastructure, with no PPE kits, no masks, etc. Just imagine what would have happened. I think, at that point in time, I was absolutely clear that whatever path India took at that time, I think will make a telling difference. And those who criticize will criticize irrespective of, for instance, when the lockdown, a partial lockdown was done during the second wave, there were people who were saying basically, why are you doing a lockdown? That is something that's par for the course. When you are in, and I think those
and
that
in noisy democracies like ours and in America, there will be counterpoints.
Correct. There would be. But I think the what if scenario is absolutely important to remember, and I have no hesitation, with evidence. I think just a simple fact, as I said, I think if you look at the per capita deaths in the United States, actually about 350 per million. India about 35 per million. If you look at even, some of the Scandinavian economies, advanced, even, they actually had about 250 odd. So I think compared to that, India did really very well. The other point to remember actually, which is that, a pandemic is a network phenomenon. Much like, for instance, let's say a product, when it's part of a larger network, it spreads faster, right? Pandemic is also, enough higher, bigger population, and in a more denser population, actually it would spread much faster. And that is what India faced as well. So not only is it the case that we had about 300 million people, who were just the elderly, but, much denser population, much bigger population, and therefore network, in such a larger network, more denser network, the spread would have been much faster. And this is something that, I think one can go, and those who basically criticize can go and read the assessments done by researchers at Johns Hopkins and Princeton University in around April, May. I remember reading those actually, and, absolutely tracking all of this, which said millions of people are going to die in India. So I think, and we can't, for instance, and there is a tendency oftentimes to actually, where at the time when there is let's say a crisis like that, people sort of do talk about all these scenarios, but when we do well, they basically dismiss all of that. I think that is not something which I like, doing a more balanced view of it. And I think those were, assessments, those were sort of scares that were there at that point in time, which actually, those were the counterfactuals. Compared to those counterfactuals, India did really well.
Okay, finally, I have to ask this from you, because I ask everybody who leads a full life, in the sense of you write a lot, you are thinking a lot, you work a lot. What do you do for managing stress? How do you keep yourself centered? What is your...
I think a very good question. In fact, there is a book now actually on mindfulness that has a chapter on me, on my spiritual practices. And I think to me that is, I think, a big part of. So I have been a follower of the art of living, Guruji Shri Ravi Shankar from 2001 onwards, when I'd gone and did my PhD at that time. So I actually try to do, some of those the exercises, the sadhana that I can say, I will admit honestly that I'm not as regular with meditation, but I'm far more regular with some of the breathing exercises. That helps me a lot. And also, some of the principles that actually I learned from my father, and I also have implemented myself, which is that, focus on what one can control, and not worry about what one cannot control. Oftentimes, a lot of stress builds up, from thinking about stuff that one can't control. It's like, I have this metaphor. Worry is like, you're sitting on a rocking chair, let's say, and you're rocking, left and right without moving anywhere. Or think about another way. Worry is basically tomorrow many different possibilities are there, and just thinking about the worst case scenario and making that actually the most important.
I was listening to a podcast, Joe Rogan podcast with Naval Ravikant. He says the same thing, that instead of cluttering your mind with so many different things, focus on what you can, what you can't. Because if you do too much, these are all
simple reasons. So the
but it's hard, no?
Well, I think it's difficult, but it's not impossible, right? And it's these are things that over time one gains. I mean, for instance, I'll give you this actual example. When I was doing my PhD, there was this PhD colleague of mine who's now a full professor at Ohio State University, and he would call and when we were doing our when we were going through our qualifiers, actually that's a stressful period because if you don't clear the qualifiers, you have to leave the PhD program. So around 2:33 would call and say that he's basically getting stressed about and my advice to him would be what I would just ask him, what are you stressed about, and then I would tell him, why don't you work on that was my principle as well. Okay. Even for instance, as I said, when I was the CA, I would get up actually at 2:33 feeling nervous about it, and then whatever I was nervous about, I would basically try and go and think about it, work on it. In other words,
how do you work? Like, do you take a paper, do you take your computer, what do you do?
So mostly on the computer. I actually sometimes when I have to sort of lay my thoughts down, think from first principles ab initio, I use pen and paper, and I think that's an aspect that it's helped me a lot, which is that even if, let's say, existing wisdom or existing literature etc. says that you have to do X, I like to think about it myself from first principles, whether I agree with X or not, and that thinking from first principles, it helps me. I want to be convinced first myself using ground up thinking that is, because it may be the case that X may have been right for a particular context and may not be right for this context, and I think that's where, for instance, COVID was a huge supply side shock. And so policies that were implemented for earlier crises, which were demand side shocks, didn't necessarily apply.
Yeah.
So I think so I read a lot, and actually as I read, I make notes. And I think oftentimes it's important to be able to synthesize. I think
you make notes while you're reading?
I do make notes while reading. I do make notes actually.
Something like your dad did.
No, I actually. So what I do is I have a Word document. Word document actually. So as I read, I either will cut paste stuff and put important stuff, put it there in a Word document.
You're reading on Kindle. That means.
No, I usually read on the computer.
Okay.
I'm reading on the computer. So I'll keep putting stuff because because what I find is actually it is really important to assimilate all of that and then look at the big picture. I think the big picture is that is the process of synthesizing. That oftentimes I think most people maybe do not give enough time to, and I think that synthesis is really critical.
So are you reading several books at the same time, or you reading?
Yes, actually I oftentimes read more academic literature, papers for instance. I read a lot of papers. So as I'm reading papers, I find important points, I'll put it in typically that document will be called material for XYZ. So that's my naming method actually. And so for instance, when I was writing,
organized. I wish I was like that.
No, I'm not that organized. If you ask my wife, she'll say, I'm the most disorganized person there. Actually.
No, but to read
or maybe
like this...
She may not say that. I think to be fair to her, she'd say, I'm not that organized. That she would say.
No, what I mean to say is that to put your thoughts down while you're reading something.
Yeah.
Because many of us think that, when I sit down to do it, I'll recall.
Yeah.
But that recall...
No, I think that doesn't happen. That's why actually, so I actually, let me admit, right? I'm very organized with my work. But I'm not that organized with other stuff,
Okay.
And this process of actually what I find is when I put all that material down and then I go through it again, that then enables me to see the interdependencies and be able to synthesize it together. Okay. I think that is what is really critical, because that is what I think big picture thinking really involves, being able to see the interdependencies. Yeah. I think in some sense, so the metaphor I like to use is actually that of the elephant and the 5 blind men. When we are reading stuff, actually a paper is about, let's say, for instance, the tail of the elephant, right? Yeah. Or maybe the trunk of the elephant.
Very Warren Buffett.
Did Warren Buffett say it? I didn't know that actually.
I mean, this is what basically read and put it all together.
So put it, and then actually being able to...
Do you shut yourself off like he does?
Yes, I do actually. I think that's, for instance, actually to give a specific instance, when, economic survey, when I was actually writing some days, I would actually, tell my office saying that today I'm going to work from home because I didn't want to be disturbed. I wanted to really think about stuff that do that process of assimilation. And I think what happens is, this is the other thing actually which I've seen, a certain comfort with ambiguity. I think that is really important.
Interesting.
Because actually, for instance,
for
again,
an economist to say comfort with ambiguity.
I think this is really critical because being able to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity. That when you take for instance the COVID episode.
Yeah, I was just about to say that.
So around March, of 2020, I remember agonizing for some time, saying, what is this crisis really about? Saying, because I remember thinking that we were taught in our and we learned that every crisis is a demand side. It's the demand side shock. But for the first time, governments are actually closing or sort of locking down their economies, asking people to stay at home. This has to mean something. And that was an uncertainty. There was ambiguity. But staying with that and with that belief that, as I need to stay with this.
And be imaginative then.
Read a lot.
Yeah.
And then keep thinking about it as well. I mean, staying with that. And I think this is something which actually, for instance, I remember this when I was preparing for the IIT JEE. I remember a question in integral calculus, which actually, it took me a day and a half to solve. And, I mean, this maybe it's funny, but I kept thinking about it. And in the morning, when I was actually going to do my morning ablutions, that's when it struck.
Okay.
So I rushed, and basically solved it. And, but staying with that for a day and a half, that ambiguity, I think helps you get over.
Okay.
I think many times we basically sort of quit because the ambiguity is like ambiguity aversion, I think. And staying with that ambiguity is really important. That's what enables one to then be able to see the interdependencies and, understand the big picture.
Okay. And you talked about Bollywood, about cricket and Bollywood. Cricket we've talked about. Bollywood, what do you watch just for chilling? Anything?
More often than not, it is something which, my wife would recommend, saying there's a good movie to watch. I would basically watch that.
So now on OTT, I'm sure.
Yes,
mostly.
on OTT.
Not a theatre.
No.
Experience.
Theatre also, actually, I don't mind watching too.
Okay.
Actually, I know. In fact, that big screen, actually, I
can't
love.
do it anymore.
Oh, you can't?
After COVID, I don't have the patience to sit through a full-length movie without getting off.
No, one thing I do when I go to watch a movie is, I'm there basically, I'm just bindas, 3 hours, I'm there to be entertained.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, that's what, so my wife will say, for instance, she says she has a very sophisticated sense of humor. I have a very, very basal sense of humor. It's very easy to make me laugh.
Okay. So those are some of the things that you would do just to chill.
Yeah, just to chill.
Right? And that's very important.
Yes, indeed. It is very important.
For the creative process also, because you are constantly working on stuff which needs which needs that
Correct.
switch off mode too.
I think stress cannot be sort of a good environment for creativity to happen. I think it's important to. The other thing is actually, so many people when they look, I'm very passionate. Passion, people will equate that to saying, oh, you must, that I internally actually I'm sort of, even though I'm passionate, I'm still quite calm.
Are you a loner?
No, I'm not a loner. I'm not a loner. Actually, I am quite extroverted, but I actually don't mind my own company too.
I've seen most economists like that. They stay on their own too.
For instance, when I'm with people, I like their company. And for instance, one thing actually, when kids come home now, actually we are empty nesters. When they come home, I enjoy their company a lot. But if I'm not there, I don't basically necessarily miss them. It's like when they're there, enjoy their company, but not miss them as such.
Do you pressurize them like parents pressurize Indian parents? Double MA karo, double PhD karo. Do you do that?
No, as I think I have been a tough dad in the sense that and that's my thing has been of tough love, both to my students and to my kids as well. Now, of course, I've eased out. Both of them have gone to college, and so actually I've eased out. But because my dad himself was very tough with me. And that's what I mean. I used to be a very happy-go-lucky kid for a long while, but for his strictness, maybe I wouldn't have ever actually achieved my potential. And many times I think maybe consciously, subconsciously, we end up sort of imitating our parents as well. So I've been that way. I've been tough. There are instances where actually I think my daughter's teachers will remember where actually she's I've been at a parent-teacher meeting and actually looking at she's not maybe done as well as I wanted maybe actually, and they can see it in my face. teachers.
Oh, wow.
So,
Okay. All right.
but that said, actually, these are aspects I must tell you I'm not very proud about.
Yeah. That's all right. All of us have guilt on our right shoulder and pride on our left shoulder when we are as parents.
Yes.
Thank you so much for sparing the time and coming to the podcast and speaking
Thank you
with
so
us.
much. Actually, as I said at the outset, it's a privilege. I really have enjoyed and watched a lot of your podcasts.
Thank you so much.
To be here itself, actually, it's so nice.
Thank you so much. Thanks and all the best. And for our viewers and listeners, go buy your book. It's a perfect Diwali gift. And if not Diwali, then for New Year's, Thanksgiving, whatever you want, pick it up absolutely right now. Thank you. Thanks.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the ANI podcast with Smita Prakash. Do like or subscribe on whichever channel you have seen this or heard this. Namaste. Jai Hind. Click here to watch the previous episodes.